to the Rhetoric Prof stream. Yesterday's stream was a failure because I was trying to set up what was happening in my office, correct settings. Couldn't figure out the correct settings until when I finally did. It was time for a faculty meeting, so I didn't get around to it. Maybe it was for the best, honestly, because I was going to do some stuff about Twitter, and to be honest with you, I haven't been feeling that. No, my feeling on Twitter recently has been a little. Feels tinny. Feels not like what I need. I don't know how you feel about it. I go back and forth. Still see some funny stuff on there. Sometimes some beautiful things, but mostly I feel like I'm wasting a lot of time when I'm on there. So I figured that instead, since classes have begun for me, I'm back at school. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about that too. Figured I'd continue with my reading series. This one is for public speaking, and it's really a great piece, classic piece by Ralph Ellison. He's one of the great American novelists. He's also in an American tradition of people who only wrote one novel. Lee Harper, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, was in that until she came out with, what was that book called? I didn't read it. Let It Stand a Watchman or something that people were upset about because Atticus Finch turned out to be racist. This is also Ralph Ellison's novel, The Invisible Man, is one of the great literary accounts of racism, and quite different maybe from some of the, and it's in a tradition almost of like picaresque comedy. What is audience? Who's audience? Why is audience? When's audience? How's audience? Hey, aliens, welcome back to the stream. Yeah, the 5 W's, right, of journalism. I think you could ask all of those questions about audience, and I think that all of those, the way I would answer those, the 5 W's of audience, might seem weird. And figuring out what audience is how is audience is an interesting one. That's an interesting one. I'm not quite sure what that would mean. But all the other ones, yeah. Who is the audience? Well, one thing I would say is the audience isn't just, and this is what we're going to read about if you stick around. Audience isn't just the people in front of you. And part of that is because, well, like obviously I'm on Twitch. People can see things later. So we create these speech documents, and they're kind of sent out into time, and they find audiences that maybe are unexpected. So that's part of it. But I think even in the moment of the people in the room, so to speak, so you aliens right now, it's the person in the chat room, even there, it's not enough to think about audiences like, oh, that individual. Because first of all, what do we know about that person? Something. But if we're going to form speech, if we're going to kind of create discourse for an audience, it can't be on the basis of just individuality. It doesn't amount to anything. So what does it mean to kind of adapt speech to or for an audience? And it's something that you kind of can't not do on one hand, because some of the readings that we did last time, the last lecture I did, I'm talking about how the public space, how that private space of thought is already totally taken by a public medium, which is language. But I mean, could also be other things that are in there. I wouldn't say that there's nothing totally not individual. So there might be some radically individual aspects of your thought, but they're probably very difficult to communicate. And if you can communicate them, at that point of transferring that memory of the tea-soaked Madeleine into language, it becomes translated into a public thought. Public in that sense that it is in the public medium of language. So Ralph Ellison, who's this great novelist of Invisible Man, and in my class, we're also reading the first chapter of Invisible Man, which is literally about public speaking. Because one of the students at an all-black high school gets an invitation to speak at effectively what a Rotary club is. I don't know what this, or the Kiwanis Club. There's lots of these kinds of clubs in North America and probably around the world. I'm not familiar with what it's like internationally, of often businessmen, often men, kind of fraternal organizations for groups of community elites. He's invited to speak at one of these, and before he's allowed to speak, and of course this is an all-white audience, before he's allowed to speak, he has to participate in a boxing match. And it's this kind of surreal, I wouldn't call it magical realist, but if you're familiar with that literary tradition, it participates a little bit in that. There's this boxing match where all of these black men are kind of set to fight against each other. And this seems totally unrelated to him, to what he's about to say. But he tries to do this, and then at the end of the boxing match, there's all sorts of weird and terrible things that happen to him before he speaks. They put money on this mat, but the mat is electrified. And then when they finally get the money, they find it's just chocolate coin. So he's bloodied up, he's kind of messed up from the fight. And he wants to talk about social issues. And so he had started by talking about social responsibility, which kind of falls on the person. He ends up talking about social, I think he talks about, not social justice, that wasn't that term. I think it was social equality, maybe? And then the audience gets angry. They don't want to hear that. So there's this kind of fantastical, I can't really do it justice. It's a great story. It's published as a short story. And it's called Battle Royal. You've maybe heard of Battle Royales, and that's based on that. Yeah, but the Battle Royal, Ralph Ellison, great story. And it's kind of a counterpart to this piece, I would say. But this piece is an essay. And it's an essay that's closely related to my concerns, because it's about audience, it's about American rhetoric, and it also is a kind of response to one of the theorists of American rhetoric, Kenneth Burke, who's really, in many ways, a literary critic. And his literary criticism brought him to a deep and profound study and reevaluation of the tradition of rhetoric. He wrote a kind of, he had planned to write a trilogy of books. He wrote many books, and they're all about rhetoric in some way. But he had a grammar of motives, a rhetoric of motives, and he was going to have a symbolic of motives. But he never quite finished it. They did collect some writings and put them together. And so I think there is a volume called Symbolic of Motives that's published under that name. I don't own that one, but I probably should look for it. Anyway, that's a lot of background. This is Ralph Ellison's story. It is kind of a story, even though it's nonfiction, that relates to American audience and what that means. So let's get started. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit more. I also got a haircut today, which was interesting. I haven't had a haircut in a long time, and I just kind of was like, I can't. I'm looking a little too shabby. I gotta do it. So it felt a little weird, but let me make sure that everyone can see this. I'm gonna move this over, and I'm gonna try this time to highlight the part of the text that I'm reading and responding to. So if you're in the video afterwards, you can kind of skip to the section that maybe you are interested in. Yeah, I know. I cleaned up a little bit. I even cleaned my room a little bit today because I talked with my girlfriend last night. And she was like, "It needs to be cleaner." She didn't mean it like, you know what I mean. Hopefully, she'll feel like it smells nice and bright in here right now. So I'm in a relatively good mood, feeling like things are a little bit clean. You know, when you have that feeling of hi at not gate. Oh, my phone might die while this is happening. So let me put my phone in before we start. This cord is so long. This is not the cord I was expecting. It's comically long. It's going. Yeah, welcome to the stream. Yeah, I don't want my phone to die. I'm using the phone to read the chat because there probably are better ways to do this, but you know, you find a way. I'll probably need water. I'll need all sorts of things. I'll get finicky, but That's kind of why I like doing it in this casual format. I don't have to like edit it out later. Who cares? You know, get some water. You can fast forward, or leave, or whatever. But yeah, this should be good. This one's pretty long, so I'm just gonna do this one today. We'll see how far we get. But it's a little longer than some stuff that I usually sign, but it's worth it. It's worth it. Okay, let's check it out. But yeah, the little man at Chehaw Station. He'll talk about what that is. But so it's kind of a strange title. It's a mystery. It doesn't tell you much. It leads you in. It was at Tuskegee Institute during the mid-1930s that I was made aware of the little man behind the stove. Which is such a strange title. You just took that sentence out and be like, what could he possibly mean? Oh, I can't highlight here. So I'll just try to keep my cursor over the area, but I can't actually. This one's not text recognized. Oh well. At the time I was a trumpeter, majoring in music, and had aspirations of becoming a classical composer. As such, shortly before the little man came to my attention, I had outraged the faculty members, who judged my monthly students' recital by substituting a certain skill of lips and fingers, intelligent and artistic structuring of emotion that was demanded in performing the music assigned to me. This part is reminds me a little bit of another book by Eugen Herrigel, which is called Zen in the Art of Archery. And you might have heard of other variations on this, like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and all of these people were responding to Herrigel's work. Herrigel was a German philosophy professor who went to Japan, and he really wanted to study Zen, but he wanted to study Zen practically, so he wanted to do one of the Zen arts, and he was like, well, I'm a pretty good hunter. Maybe I'll try archery, not realizing how ridiculous that analogy would be. But anyway, he picked it up, and he studied for years with a Zen master of archery. And at one point in the book, he talks about how he kind of figures out a way to hit the bullseye every time by doing something with his thumb. He kind of like notches it in a certain way. And the master gets extremely angry at him. And he says, I will never teach you again. And eventually they resolve this issue. But he like violated the art, right? Because he wasn't doing the art. He was just kind of like, he was doing a little trick. He was kind of being a little slippery. And I think that's kind of what Ralph Ellison was doing here. Rather than kind of like performing with the proper technique, he was kind of being a little loose, a little tricky in the way that he was performing. So, afterward, still dressed in my hired tuxedo, if you are American and you're not used to the UK English, you might be people like, I'm gonna hire a cab. So this idea of like renting and hiring for us, we think about hiring employees, but hiring can mean renting, like a rented tuxedo. Afterwards, still dressed in my hired tuxedo, my ears burning from the harsh negatives of their criticism, I sought solace in the basement studio of Hazel Harrison, highly respected concert pianist and teacher. Hazel Harrison had been one of Ferruccio Busoni's prized pupils, had lived until the rise of Hitler had driven her back to the USA, that was not yet ready to recognize her talents, Busoni's home in Berlin, and was a friend of such masters as Egon Petri, Percy Granger, and Sergei Prokofiev. That's like high level. It was not the first time that I had appealed to Miss Harrison's generosity of spirit, but today her reaction to my rather adolescent complaint was less than sympathetic. One quick note on Hazel Harrison. Of course, all these people are real. Hazel Harrison was the first African-American pianist to play as a concert pianist with a European orchestra. So this was you can still see, I think there are some recordings of her. Pretty sure there are. I don't remember what she was playing, but you can probably look it up and find out what she did. But baby, she said, in this country, you must always prepare yourself to play your very best, wherever you are, and on all occasions. But everybody tells you that, I said. Yes, she said. But there's more to it than you're told. Of course, you've always been taught to do your best, look your best, be your best. You've been told such things all your life, but now you're becoming a musician, an artist. When it comes to performing the classics in this country, there's something more involved. Watching me closely, she paused. Are you ready to listen? Yes, ma'am. All right, she said. You must always play your best, even if it's only in the waiting room at Chehaw Station. Because in this country, there'll always be a little man hidden behind the stove. So, like, just bizarre, bizarre advice from this great concert pianist. Just like, what is she talking about? A what? She nodded. That's right. There'll always be the little man whom you don't expect. And he'll know the music, and the tradition, and the standards of musicianship required for whatever you set out to perform. So, at first, he thinks that she's kind of just telling him, like, you should do better, young, kind of doing that, like, old-timey scoldy thing. But she's saying something weird here. And she's highlighting something strange about it by using a strange metaphor. She's trying to make it strange. A Lilliput? That's a nice reference. Yeah, I mean, Stuart Little could be, oh man, I'm have a mouse issue right now. I'm doing crazy stuff trying to catch this mouse. So maybe it's a nice mouse and I should just befriend it. Maybe that'll be the end of the I don't know, Stuart Little. I think you'll see who it is. All the way at the end, he gives you some examples. No, it's like a real person. That's kind of what's crazy about this. The little man behind the stove is an imagination of the real kind of people that you might meet. And it is unique to America, but I don't think it's as unique to America as maybe he thinks it is. But let's see what he says. Speechless, I stared at her. After the working over I just received from the faculty, I was in no mood for joking. But no, Miss Harrison's face was quite serious. So what did she mean? Chehaw Station was a lonely whistle stop where swift north or southbound trains paused with haughty impatience to drop off or take on passengers. Point where, on homecoming weekends, special coaches crowded with festive visitors were cut loose, coupled to a waiting switch engine, and hauled to Tuskegee's railroad siding. I knew it well, and as I stood beside Miss Harrison's piano, visualizing the station, he's got this in mind, just this like godforsaken thoroughfare, nobody's paying any attention. I told myself she has got to be kidding. There was, which violinist it was a few years ago, who, concert violinist, who went in the New York City subways and was playing what he was going to play that night, at the symphony or the Met or whatever. And he's like, most people are just passing by. But of course, that's your expectations. You're like, yeah, it's just a street performance, right? You're not like attuned to listen to the music. You're like, wow. Most people aren't going to be like, wow, that's a world-class musician, because you're not expecting it in that environment. And so he's like, why would he do it there? People are just going to pass you by, kind of like they did. For in my view, the atmosphere of Chehaw's claustrophobic little waiting room was enough to discourage even a blind street musician from picking out blues on his guitar, no matter how tedious his wait for a train. Biased toward disaster by bruised feelings. Biased toward disaster by bruised feelings. My imagination pictured the vibration set in motion by the winding of a trumpet within that drab utilitarian structure. So it's an ugly building. First shattering, then bringing its walls a-tumbling down, like Jericho's at the sounding of the Joshua's priest-blown ram horns. So, in the Hebrew Bible, there's a moment where they surround Jericho for 7 days. They blow their shofars, their horns, and this like takes down the walls of Jericho. So you just imagine he's like, the only reason I want to blow my trumpet in Chehaw Station is to destroy it. It's a terrible place. So you got to imagine for yourself like the most godforsaken place that you could go, and the kind of standard that you would hold a musician, if you were a musician or any artist. How they're being like, yeah, even there, I should hold myself high standard. Okay, so what's going on here? True, Tuskegee possessed a rich musical tradition, both classical and folk, and many music lovers and musicians lived or moved through its environs. But, and my regard for Miss Harrison notwithstanding, Chehaw Station was the last place in the area where I would expect to encounter a connoisseur lying in wait to pounce upon some rash, unsuspecting musician. Sure, a connoisseur might hear the haunting blues-echoing train whistle rhapsodies blared by fast express trains as they thundered past. But the classics? Chance. So, a Miss Harrison watched to see the effect of her. I said with a shrug, yes, ma'am. She smiled, her prominent eyes a twinkle. I hope so, she said. You don't just now. You will by the time you become an artist. So remember the little man behind the stove. With that, seating herself at the piano, she began thumbing through a sheaf of scores, a signal that our discussion was ended. That's a style. So I thought, you asked for sympathy, and you get a riddle. I would have felt better if she had said, sorry, baby, I know how you feel. But after all, I was there. I heard you. You treated your audience as though you were some kind of confidence man with a horn, so forget it. Because I will not violate my own standards by condoning sterile musicianship. Some such reply, by reaffirming the sacred principles of art, which we are both committed, would have done much to supply the emotional catharsis for which I was appealing. He's like, can you just yell at me in a normal way? You know, just be like, you need to be better. And there's something, this weirdness threw him off. It interrupted what he was expecting. By refusing, she forced me to accept full responsibility and thus learn from my offense. The condition of artistic communication is, as the saying goes, hard, fair. But although disappointed and puzzled by Miss Harrison's Sibylline response, the Sibyls were like the ancient carriers of prophecy in Rome, I respected her artistry and experience too highly to dismiss it. Besides, something about her warning of a cultivated taste that asserted its authority out of obscurity sounded faintly familiar. So let's just highlight that this is kind of what the little man will be. A cultivated taste that asserted its authority out of obscurity. So it's not the authoritative taste coming from l'Académie Française, or it's not the kind of like most respected Carnatic musician that that is coming to kind of say, oh, this Punjabi music is just for the riffraff. This is not what we're talking about here. This is someone coming out of nowhere that has a cultivated taste, but they're not in any expected position where you would expect that taste to emerge. Hadn't I once worked for an eccentric millionaire who prowled the halls and ballrooms of his fine hotel looking like a derelict who had wandered in off the street? This is kind of like the original Secret Boss, that terrible show. Yes, and woe unto the busboy or waiter, hallman or maid, or anyone else caught debasing the standards of that old man's house. For then, lashing out with the abruptness of reality, shattering the contrived facade of a practical joke, the apparent beggar revealed himself as an extremely irate and exacting host of taste. So he's kind of like taking a step in the right direction, maybe, of what she means. But he's still imagining like the owner of the house as being the person, and they're just disguising themselves as a lowly beggar. And we're going to see that that's not quite really what she's talking about. Thus, as I leaned into the curve of Miss Harrison's Steinway, that's a brand of piano, and listened to an interpretation of Liszt's Rhapsody, during which she carried on an enthusiastic, stylistic analysis of passages that Busoni himself had marked for expressional subtlety, the little man of Chehaw Station fixed himself in my mind so vividly that today he not only continues to engage my mind, often materializes when I least expect him. As, for instance, when I'm brooding over some problem of literary criticism, like, say, the rhetoric of American fiction. Indeed, the little stove warmer, which is kind of funny, has come to symbolize nothing less than the enigma of aesthetic communication in American democracy, whatever's left of it. I especially associate him with the metamorphic character of the general American audience, and with the unrecognized and unassimilated elements of its taste. So unassimilated, like they don't all kind of come together in some perfect theory of taste. It's just kind of, it's a little bit motley, which is a word you might have heard me use if you're in class, you're in the Section 1 class on Monday, motley, or someone else said hodgepodge. It's a little bit of this hodgepodge, unassimilated elements of its taste. For me, he represents that unknown quality which renders American audience far more than a receptive instrument that may be dominated through a skillful exercise of the sheerly rhetorical elements, flash and filigree of the artist's craft. So you can't just kind of like, you can't have this kind of academic mastery in order to wow an American audience. Something else that you need. While that audience is eager to be transported, astounded, thrilled, it counters the artist's manipulation of forms with an attitude of antagonistic cooperation. Antagonistic cooperation, that is what we would call an oxymoron. It's an apparent contradiction. We don't usually think of antagonist as cooperating, kind of working against. How can it go together? But one of the things that's nice about an oxymoron is it isn't just contradiction. It seems to us at first as an audience like something that shouldn't work, but that leads us potentially to a new idea. So oxymoron can be a very, speaking of rhetorical flash and filigree, this might be an example of it, despite the fact that he said it's not enough. So what's an example of antagonistic cooperation? He'll give us some. Acting for better or worse as both collaborator and judge. Collaborator and judge. Like a strange orchestra upon which a guest conductor would impose his artistic vision, it must be exhorted, persuaded, even wooed as the price of its applause. So we're not going to kind of just... I was once in Sweden, and I went to a concert. I believe it was Mahler's Second Symphony. And at the end of this long symphonic work, the Swedes or Finns who were in the audience all started clapping, but all in perfect unison. I was kind of looking, me and my friend I was kind of looking around being like, this feels strange. I have nothing against Swedish or anything. But maybe that is why that even the applause there was kind of coordinated. And I think one thing that, for me, applause only sounds nice when it kind of is noisy, and it's, if it gets too rhythmic, it gets a little corny, right? Everyone should kind of individually applaud at their own rate and for their own length of time, and that gives us a different sense of what happened than if everyone kind of claps together. It's an undeveloped thought, but okay. It must be appealed to on the basis of what it assumes to be truth. It must be appealed to on the basis of what it assumes to be truth, as a means of inducting it into new dimensions of artistic truth. By playing artfully upon the audience's sense of experience and form, the artist seeks to shape its emotions and perceptions to his vision, or her vision, while it, in turn, simultaneously cooperates and resists. Says yes and says no, in an it takes two to tango binary response to their effort. As representative of the American audience writ small, the little man draws upon the uncodified Americanness of his experience, whether of life or of art, as he engages in a silent dialogue with the artist's exposition of forms, offering or rejecting the work of art on the basis of what he feels to be its affirmation or distortion of American experience. So when people say, no, that's not right, it's not like that. They have in mind their own standard, be like, that show, no, that's not how it is. That show didn't get it right. It wasn't true to life, wasn't true to experience. Now, that might be kind of a kind of naive realism that people expect. It ought to kind of reflect the world. But even if it is, I think what Ralph Ellison is saying is that, well, what people think the world is already a kind of weird idea that is very distinct and unique, and you have to understand it if you want to appeal to people. And you got to kind of play off of that. You can't just ignore it. You can do something else, but you have to acknowledge it. You have to play off of it, of that sense of their expectations. Whether it's an affirmation or distortion of, in this case, American experience. Perhaps if they were fully aware of his incongruous existence, incongruous meaning like it doesn't quite go together. When shapes are congruent, right, fit together, it's incongruous, a little bit off, a little bit weird, but not necessarily bad. The little man's neighbors would reject him as a source of confusion, a threat to social order, and a reminder of the unfinished details of this powerful nation. I like that phrase, the unfinished details of this powerful nation. We got a whole lot of unfinished details But out of a stubborn individualism born of his democratic origins, he insists upon the cultural necessity of his role and argues that if he didn't exist, he would have to be invented. So this whole thing now, who is he? He's talking about the little man. And this is in rhetoric, we sometimes give a name to this, which is called prosopopeia, which is you kind of create a figure and kind of speak through them. And he's doing this a little bit indirectly. He's not kind of creating a speech for this little man, but he's kind of saying, well, this is what he would say. But he's a fiction. In fact, he's a personification of a whole realm of experience. So there's the average audience. These are the average audience who are on the Nextdoor app being like, have you seen this little man at Chehaw Station? They're very concerned and nervous. So it's not the average or the representative audience. It's a kind of distinctive quality of American audiences that is represented by a certain kind of individual. It's not most individuals, but it's the kind of individual that Hazel Harrison and Ralph Ellison are saying, that's who we need to attend to. Out of a stubborn individualism born of his democratic origins, he insists upon the cultural necessity of his role and argues that if he didn't exist, he would have to be invented, which is a little bit of a funny idea because he was, of course, invented by Hazel Harrison and now Ralph Ellison. And this is Voltaire. I believe it was Voltaire. Was it Diderot or Voltaire? One of the French philosophes had a pithy line that said, if God did not exist, he would have to be invented. All right, so he's playing off that idea. Is it God or the devil? Either way, you get it. If he were not already manifest in the flesh, he would still exist and function as an idea and ideal because, like such character traits as individualism, restlessness, self-reliance, love of the new, and so on, he is a linguistic product of the American scene and language, and a manifestation of the idealistic action of the capital A, capital W, American word, as it goads its users toward a perfection of our revolutionary ideals. There's a lot going on to this. It's hard to know where to stop and unpack. But we might say here, we might focus on, what do you think he means by calling the little man a linguistic product? He hasn't kind of really introduced the full idea yet. So he's still preparing us for how to understand the strange idea that he's putting forward about American audience. It's a linguistic product. So a certain kind of historical set of forces that have preceded us have led to this particular product. And he connects it towards a kind of almost the gadfly-like idea of holding us up to our own ideals, but revolutionary ideals. Of course, he's in part referencing the American Revolution. But what are those revolutionary ideals? Well, we often quote certain phrases from those revolutionary documents and in American education. Sometimes as an ideology of, we are the greatest, we have already achieved these. But if you turned it around and said, you ought to be this, you haven't been this, it would sound a little different. What would all that mean to say that we are created equal, with unalienable rights? If we were to apply that to art, and that's kind of what the little man is doing. Little man behind the stove. It's kind of holding what you could call a political ideal of the founding fathers. He's holding it towards art. And that's going to create this whole strange thing. Little man. For the artist, a lightning rod attracting unexpected insights and a warning against stale preconceptions. The man behind Chehaw's stove also serves as a metaphor for those individuals we sometimes meet. They can be real people whose refinement of sensibility is inadequately explained by family background, formal education, or social status. So, you meet somebody. I've met a lot of people like this in my life. I'll tell you about a few of them a little bit briefly. A lot of times it's in bars, folks. Met a guy, Lower East Side. Was getting a little bit slosh. at this bar, and this old man walks in, and I'm having this strange conversation with this other guy about Carlos Castaneda, who was a journalist who went to Mexico and took a bunch of peyote, and he was like, I'm really into this. And I was like, oh yeah, I read those books when I was younger, and we were talking a little bit about that. And then this guy Frank comes in, and all the bartenders, they were all like, hey Frank. He always just came in for a water, and his apartment was above the bar. And I would go there. I went there regularly, and he would start inviting me into his apartment, and it was just stacked up everywhere with books. It was filthy. The apartment was disgusting. It was stacked up everywhere with books. But he always would do this crazy. He knew he'd read all of these books, and he was like, "Here, you have to take this book." But then he would force me to pay for them. But he would only charge me like $5. It was very strange. And he was like, "Byzantine art, you need to read it." I was like, "What?" And he would do this. Or I've also met people playing chess. You meet some of these chess sharpers down in. Let's say again in New York in Washington Square Park, and I remember a guy who I was like, I'll pay you $10 if you give me a lesson about chess. Chess has got 4 elements, right? All these kind of people. I know, so I've met a lot of these people in my life. Often they're older people who maybe are poor, maybe they don't have a college education, but they know a lot more. And I'm telling you, I'm not exaggerating. They know a lot more, and they're a lot sharper than a lot of people I know who have PhDs. Or professionals who have professional deformation, occupational psychosis, who have begun to only see the world through their training. And one of the things that these more unique people have, maybe, is that they have that hodgepodge. They take from a little bit of all these different experiences and bring them together. Hard to do these people justice in a short time because they're so different from who you usually meet. You do meet them. So he says, these individuals seem to have been sensitized by some obscure force that see issues undetected from the chromatic scale of American social hierarchy. What's a chromatic scale? Well, chroma means colorful, but in music it means da 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 da. It means going up by half steps. So if you're playing a trumpet, right? And remember, he's a trumpet player. He's playing da 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 da. And in jazz and in a lot of other kinds of music, chromatic scales get used to add color to the music. So he's playing there. That's a kind of really subtle metaphor that's suggesting quite a bit. Both music and color, all these kinds of things. A force that throws off strange ultrasonic, ultra-semitones. Really in the weeds stuff. You got to have a really trained ear for this. In fact, this reminds me of another one of these strange people, Harry Partch, who is an American composer, but he was like a hobo, literally, and he created his own system of music, which is based on the microtones, and created all of his own instruments. Eccentric people, right? Who was listening to the songs of the hobos that he was traveling around with, and would then set them into these strange compositions. Yeah, you could say the chromatic is all of the notes. Yeah, so the chromatic scale is kind of it hits all. If you look at a keyboard. You play all of the notes going up and going down. That's a chromatic scale. Yeah, for sure. Hey, Alan, what's up? Where are we? In this, heredity doubtless plays an important role. But whatever that role may be, it would appear that culturally, environmentally, such individuals are products of errant but sympathetic vibrations set up by the tension between America's social mobility, its universal education, and its relative freedom of cultural information. Now, you might say, it doesn't seem like that much anymore. Remember, this was written a while ago. This is an older essay. But this idea that America has social mobility, universal education, and the freedom of cultural information. Well, what are those institutions that make cultural information free? Libraries might be one. The internet might be another. And so today there are a lot of autodidacts, people who teach themselves, mostly because they read stuff online. Autodidacts, even though I have a PhD, I sometimes consider myself an autodidact because stuff I write about really has nothing to do with what I got a degree in, or very little. And but there are the genuine autodidacts, the kind of people who just go to the library and teach themselves stuff, or the people who just like pop into the mechanic shop and they're like, how do I do that? They just kind of go around and figure stuff out. They often tend to be these kind of people who have a really unique view on the world. From the point of view of the elite institution, the autodidact has gaps in their knowledge because they didn't follow the curriculum that everyone else followed. But those gaps you might think of as almost like neuronal gaps. Electricity goes across them. They make connections that other people wouldn't, who have a more formal or traditional education. They have what in old-timey rhetoric we would call ingenuum, ingeniousness. You could think about what is genius? Is it some kind of divine gift? It could be, I guess. I think it's more the ability to see the likeness in things that are conventionally dissimilar. To see, well, those things could be related. Those concepts, this tool, that piece of material, these things could be brought together. And that synthetic idea is what ingeniousness is, the ability to see those connections. And so if you're an autodidact, you're just always trying to put stuff together. Because you don't, what else are you going to do? If you have the traditional formal schooling, you're like, well, this goes with that because that's what's on the syllabus. So you're not too worried. You don't, and therefore you maybe aren't as trained in ingeniousness if you have traditional education. That's not to say that there's no value in traditional education, of course. Just to value the autodidact for a minute. See what we can get from that. Okay, back to the reading. Characterized by a much broader random accessibility than class and economic restrictions would appear to allow, this cultural information includes many of the finest products of the arts and intellect. Products that are so abundantly available in the forms of books, graphics, recordings, and pictorial reproductions as to escape sustained attempts at critical evaluation. Just how these characteristics operate in concert, that just means together here, involves the mysterious interaction between environment and personality, instinct and culture, with the frequency and wide dispersal of individuals who reveal the effects of this mysterious configuration of forces, endows each American audience, whether of musician, poet, plastic artist, with a special mystery of its own. So one thing on plastic artists mean people who are like sculptors, people who are moving things around. Plastic really just means changeable. We now have the idea of plastics, but that comes after this other meaning. Okay. I say mystery, but perhaps the phenomenon is simply a product of our neglect of serious cultural introspection, looking within. Our failure to conceive of our fractured, vernacular-weighted culture as an intricate whole. So what's vernacular? Vernacular is not the high discourse. So in early modern Europe, for instance, vernaculars were French, German, Italian, and the other language, the high language, was Latin. The vernaculars were the languages that the common people spoke. Now those are themselves elite languages. Interesting. Yeah, colonialism had a role in that. But vernacular often can be just the kind of slangy, creative idea of language, part of language, rather than its official. So the vernacular weighted culture, fractured vernacular weighted culture, it's an interesting idea of that. The culture kind of maybe emphasizes that, and then to conceive of that all as an intricate whole. But there isn't just a high culture and a low culture. It's hard. I think that that's probably true in every culture. I don't really believe that there's ever a clear separation. If there is a clear separation, it has to be enforced. But because high culture is always, in some sense, drawing upon common culture, right? Folk music of Hungary then appears in classical music, or the songs of the Bengali field workers appear in the raga, so things like that happen all the time. But here, I think he's like, in America, it's even harder to see any distinction, high and low culture. I don't know if that's true or not. And since there is no reliable sociology of the dispersal of ideas, styles, or tastes in this turbulent American society, It is possible that, personal origins aside, the cultural circumstances here described offer the intellectually adventurous individual what might be termed a broad social mobility of intellect and taste. So you might not be able to move up in terms of class or in terms of economic position, if that's not class. That might be the idea of the American dream. But you might be able to move in terms of intellect and taste, plus an incalculable scale of possibilities for self-creation. You can become so many different things, is the idea. Seems very optimistic, doesn't it? When I first read this, I was like, this is way too optimistic. But that's kind of why I like to pair it with his novel, where you see this high comic, but tragic comic view of an America in which this individual, the invisible man, can't get any recognition to the point that he is invisible. So something's happening when Ellison appears optimistic. You might kind of hear a touch of irony in it. But I think that his optimism is not unseasoned. He's experienced quite a bit of the darkness of America. And so nevertheless, he comes to tell us this. So what might that mean? While the force that seems to have sensitized those who share the little man of Chehaw Station's unaccountable knowingness, how did he know this stuff? How did this guy in the bar know about the Byzantine art? Where does this come from, this knowledge? You shouldn't know these things. Yeah, that's the idea. Call it a climate of free-floating sensibility, appears to be a random effect generated by a society in which certain assertions of personality, formerly the prerogative of high social rank, have become the privilege of the anonymous and the lowly. Okay, let's take apart some of those words there. What's a prerogative? It's my prerogative, meaning it's my privilege, my right, based on my status. So you might get perks. Perks and prerogatives are the same thing at a job. Oh, I get a perk for my position. I get to park in a nice spot or something. But the prerogatives of rank, right? In a kind of 19th century England, certain aristocratic people would become very eccentric as a way of describing their, as a way of kind of asserting their personality. And he's saying that is now in America more free-floating. They've become the privilege of the anonymous and the lowly. So that person who you kind of see around your neighborhood, I knew one guy in Pittsburgh. He would walk around with a shovel. Oh man, a lot of Pittsburgh characters fit this description. Walk around with a shovel and kind of knock on people's doors and ask them if they needed any work done. Okay, so he was kind of trying to hustle, trying to make a living, but he would also have this kind of interesting interactions with people. He would be like, "I'm the watchdog," so he named himself this. It's like, "I'm the watchdog." He's like, "I got your back." I was like, "Hey, watchdog, what you see today?" And he'd be like, "Oh," he would kind of like give you this little weather report of what he's seeing in the neighborhood. Things seem okay today. This kind of guy. Lots of these, but he was anonymous, right? He kind of even hid his own name, but he created this personality out of his own anonymity. Very likely was unhoused person, but knew a lot. Had quite a bit of experience. Okay, if this be true, the matter of the artist's ability to identify the mixed background and general character of his audience can be more problematical than might be assumed. You can't just do a questionnaire. I know I'm always yelling about this. People get tired of it. These stupid textbooks that say, just do a questionnaire of your audience. It's ridiculous, impractical, but also wrong-headed. In the field of literature, it presents a problem of rhetoric. Question of how to fashion strategies of communication that will bridge the many divisions of background and taste which any representative American audience embodies. So now we are going back to representativeness. I said at first, the little man was kind of a distinctive individual, surrounded by all these normies that are afraid of the little man, what represents. But now Ellison's kind of taking us out of that personification and saying, no, the American audience, and he's a writer, right? So he's thinking of an audience for writing, but I think it's still true of speech. American audience representatively has this kind of diversity shot throughout it. To the extent that American literature is both an art of discovery and an artistic agency for creating a consciousness, cultural identity. The great American novel, you might say. It is of such crucial importance as to demand of the artist not only an eclectic resourcefulness, pick up a little from here, pick a little from here. That's the hodgepodge. That's the kind of pied piper, not pied piper, pied. What does pied mean? It means colorful. A piebald horse has lots of color. This idea of being colorful. An eclectic resourcefulness of skill, but an act of democratic faith. Back to faith again. Faith that the democracy, I think, represents something that's worth knowing. In this light, the American artist will do his best, not only because of his dedication to his form, his craft, right? That's what Hazel Harrison at the beginning, he was like, I wish you would just say, I stand for the standards of art. She's like, no, it's about the audience, baby, but it's about a particularly weird part of the audience, this strange little man, right? So it's not about the craft, this kind of divine mandate of the art. You must speak correctly, but about the audience. It's not vertical, it's horizontal. And that's what we have to be faithful to. In this light, the American audience will do his best, not only because of his dedication to his form, his craft. Every MFA student loves to say this. Oh yes, the craft of writing, these kinds of things. But because he realizes that, despite an inevitable unevenness of composition, the chances are that any American audience will conceal at least one individual whose knowledge and taste will complement or surpass his own. So he's basically saying, wherever you go, there's going to be a little stove, a little man behind the stove, or a little woman, or a little person behind the stove. Because even though not everybody is like this, not every American audience is like this, America is mixed up enough that sometimes a lot of times you're gonna pull out that yellow ball from the bin of white. It's not every time. So you should always act as if there's a little man behind the stove. That's what you have. That's what your faith is to. Your faith is to this kind of possibility in the audience. I really like this because on the one hand, rhetoricians like myself, we like to talk about audience. But sometimes this kind of evens out into this generic idea. And I don't think that's very helpful. Because that ends up folding us back into something that's prior to experience, that this kind of theoretical model of what we should do. But isn't it, audience is all about what's empirical, about lived experience, about what's really happening. And so you're in the position, really, if you care about audience, of never fully knowing. You never really totally know the audience. So people say, know your audience. But that's the kind of hysterical demand that you have to put upon yourself. I have to know my audience, and I can't know my audience. It's impossible to, and I must. Yeah? And it's in that gap that creative things happen. And Ellison is adding to that, this image of, well, who in the audience are you really speaking to? Who's kind of the ideal of the audience? And it's this person who is the most colorful. It's not the person who is kind of the most serious or the most reasonable. The person who's the most colorful. It has the greatest variety of experience that they've kind of, in some incongruous way, brought together. And he's going to give us examples of it. We'll get there. Yeah. We're going pretty slow, but I enjoy this piece so much. I don't mind taking a slow stroll through. This, to paraphrase Miss Harrison, is because even the most homogeneous audiences are culturally mixed and embody in their relation, in their relative anonymity, the mystery of American cultural identity. That identity, tentative, controversial, constantly changing, is confusing to artists and audience alike. So rather than saying American, what's real America, right? Rather than trying to kind of purify the essence of America, that can get pretty dicey. He's saying the identity of America is that it's kind of wild. It's always changing. Okay? And it's confusing. And my students know that confusion is not a bad thing in our class. You got to learn how to articulate your confusion. Then we're an inquiry. To the audience, because it is itself of mixed background, and seldom fully conscious of the cultural or even political implications of its own wide democratic range. To the artist, because in the broadest thrust of his effort, he directs his finest effects to an abstract and thus ideal refinement of sensibility, which, because it is not the exclusive property of a highly visible elite, l'Académie Française in France, right? Again, they're like, oh, what would be the perfect kind of art? Well, the most refined critics will be the ones that determine it. Well, in America, it's not that. So it's difficult to pinpoint. As one who operates within the historical frame of his given art, the artist may direct himself to those who are conscious of the most advanced state of his art. Oops. His artistic peers. So, okay, we don't have an elite. Maybe I'm going to be an artist of artists. People like to say this about, the Velvet Underground or Steely Dan. They're your favorite band's favorite band, right? Or Immortal Technique. This is your favorite rapper's favorite rapper, something like that. But here's what Ellison comes in. But if his work has social impact, which is one gauge of its success as symbolic communication, it will reach into unpredictable areas. Many of us, by the way, read our first Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Mann in barbershops, heard our first opera on phonographs, right? So culture kind of doesn't come from, oh, I read Hemingway in Oxford. Well, they probably wouldn't even read Hemingway in Oxford, let's be real. Or heard opera when my nanny took me to the Met. Kind of comes through the window of somebody else's apartment. In fact, my upstairs neighbor is always playing Mozart. You kind of can catch little in the night. I think she falls asleep to it. So I'm always getting like little clips of this, while I'm also getting people kind of like blasting merengue from the other end of the block. And that's kind of part of that mix, exciting mix. Thus, the ideal level of sensibility to which the American artist would thus address himself tends to transcend the lines of class, religion, region, and race, floating, as it were, free in the crowd. I wonder if you would agree with that. I mean, things have changed a lot since he wrote this essay. Would you agree that the ideal level of sensibility should be something that transcends the lines of class, religion, region, and race? I think today, many students that I've encountered would say, nothing can do that. We can't, the attempt to transcend this moves into whiteness, or moves into kind of it becomes an invisibility of what is the hegemonic discourse. And I think often that is the case. But I do think that what Ellison's pointing out of like the kind of mixed up vision of art is something that I've experienced. And it might be an experience that not everybody's had. But I have some democratic faith in that. So I don't know if I would describe it today as transcending the lines of class, religion, region, race, but it's something that kind of, let's say, it's kind of like a thief of taste. It's not like a taste that is the purview of some particular class, but it's always in the kind of position of like, what can I take? Yeah, it's almost a little bit greedy. It's a greedy kind of taste. I'm going to take from wherever I can get it. So I might steal from high culture, but I might grab from low culture too. I'm going to grab it from wherever I can. Yeah, it's that almost idea that I think you're talking about. They are like the memory registers of certain computer systems. It is simultaneously accessible at any point in American society. This is the kind of collective unconscious as computer system. Such are the circumstances that render the little man at Chehaw Station not only possible, but inevitable. Little break here. We're going to keep going, though. I'm curious what you think. The chat's a little quiet. What do you think so far about this piece? Pretty long. I don't know what I'm doing, on Twitch with stuff. But it's hard to digest. Ingredients for art. Yeah, exactly. I think in thinking about ingredients. Oh yeah, for sure. No, I don't assume that anyone's like attending really closely. Kind of curious what you're. Yeah, I mean, I think that's another way of thinking about the little man. It's like someone who's gonna kind of dip in and out. It's exactly what we're talking about. Someone who's like got all the. Okay, here's a good example. This next one has a good example. So this might help us. But who then is this little man of Miss Harrison's riddle? From behind what unlikely mask does he render his judgments? And by what magic of art can his most receptive attention, his grudging admiration, be excited? No idle questions, these. Like Shakespeare's Hamlet, The little man has his pride, complexity. He values his personal uniqueness, cherishes his privacy, and clings to that tricky democratic anonymity, which makes locating him an unending challenge. Oh, you missed the little man part? So it's right at the beginning of the essay. Ralph Ellison's a trumpet player. I mean, he ends up becoming a famous writer, but he was a trumpet player at the time, and he has this recital where he kind of like is a little loosey-goosey with it, you could say. And he gets reamed out. The little man equals the audience, but it's a transformation of the idea of audience. The little man is like a particular kind of character that might appear in any American audience. So it's not the audience writ large, it's the audience writ small. It's a certain kind of characteristic. And he goes to Hazel Harrison, who's this pianist, and she says, you gotta always perform your best, because even at Chehaw Station, which is this like godforsaken train stop, someone there will have a sophisticated taste, you know. So it's the idea of like the sophistication of taste that someone might have, who will know the tradition, know the knowledge, know what needs to be known, who won't let you go off scot-free. What comes out of obscurity? It's not the elites. Somebody else, some anonymous person will know this. It's kind of what he's talking about. Yeah. So here's a good example, and maybe I'll play a little bit of this music for you. Hamlet masked himself with madness. The little man plays mute. And I've had this experience with students too. Students who say nothing all year long, and then at one point they kind of come out with some like brilliant comment where they're like, they just should, and you're like, oh damn, you've been the little man, the little woman behind the stove this whole time. They're always there. That's the thing. They're not going to let you know that they're there, so you gotta expect them. Drawn to the brightness of bright lights, he cloaks himself in invisibility, perhaps because, in the shadow of his anonymity, he can be both the vernacular cat, who looks at and listens to, the tradition-bound or fad-struck king, and the little boy who sees clearly the artist-emperor's pretentious nakedness. Well, yeah, so Alan says, for me, I don't think an audience member has to have knowledge to be blown away by something. Not sure if that's what the piece is saying, but it sounds a little like... I think it's more that the audience member is like a harsh... the audience member is like, or the little man, is, you know the story of the emperor's new clothes, right? Some confidence artist, some con man comes and says, we have the most beautiful thread, but it has like a magical quality that anyone who is, you know the story, but I'll just say it really quickly anyway. Anyone who is stupid can't see it. So the king puts it up. Wow, beautiful. And of course, there's no clothes. And so at one point, everyone, when the emperor comes out totally naked, is like sweating. Oh, I don't want anyone to know that I can't see it because they know I'm stupid. And nobody else can see it. And they're like, I don't want to let anyone else know I'm stupid. But then a child goes, why is the emperor naked? And everyone starts laughing. Yeah. So that it's the classic metaphor of kind of showing up the pretentiousness of someone who's like, someone's just like, it's obvious, right? So it's kind of that position, more than the position of being blown away. It's more the position of being a critic that is also a collaborator, as he puts it earlier in the essay. So he talks about Garcia Lorca, right? That's a poet, writes of a singer who presented an audience of cantejondo lovers with a voice and restraint of passion, better suited to a recital of bel canto, which is the Italian style of opera. Hooray! Responded a deadpan Spanish cousin of the ghost of Chehaw Station, for the school of Paris. So this is quite witty. It's a little bit hard to understand. I might play you a little cantejondo, so you get the feel of like what it's supposed to sound like. This is a style of music that is often, you know, a guy is sitting in a chair and it's powerful music, you know. You are drinking while you sing this. If you sing it like if you sing it like, I'm not sure that this one will be a good example. Well, let's try it out. I wonder if you'll be able to hear it. Let me know if you can't hear it. I can't hear it either. Why is it not playing? Even I can't hear it. Oh, I wonder if it's going through, it's like outputting through the mic. Oh, I probably have to set that up later differently. But you can find this on YouTube. Obviously, you just type in Cante Hondo. This is a good video. I think this one. But it's like, it's got like some pressure in the voice. There's some like intensity in the voice. I'm not going to pretend I can do it. But this person who kind of sings it like in this pure sound, they're like, hooray for the School of Paris. That you like, you've done it, but you've not done it the way that you needed to do it for us. And that's a little bit of the little man. Yeah, I know, there's no sound for me either. I didn't hear anything. I think it's going through the Yeti mic, but I don't want to play around with the settings while I'm doing it. So, but it's good. I keep learning my errors as I go. We'll have to play around with that later. So, which is to say that having been randomly exposed to diverse artistic conventions, the little man has learned to detect the true transcendent ambience created by successful art from chic shinola. You know what I'm saying? Chic shinola. I don't think we know what shinola is anymore. But what was Shinola? Shinola is an American luxury goods retailer based in Detroit. It produces watches. Shinola takes its defunct Shinola shoe polish company. Yeah, I think it's the shoe polish that he's probably referring to. But low grade. Yeah, low grade. Something that's just kind of flashy. That's not going to pass. Form should fit function, says he. And now we're fully in prosopopeia. He's speaking in the person of the little man. Form should fit function, says he. And style, theme. That is, style should fit theme. Just as punishment should fit crime, which it seldom does nowadays, right? So even here he's kind of like that guy you meet in Lower East Side. He's like, oh, or as a well-made shoe the foot. Something of an autodidact, he has his own hierarchical ranking of human values, both Native American and universal. Not Native American in the sense of American Indians, but what is native to America and what is universal. And along with these, his own range of pieties. This Ellison is cribbing directly from Kenneth Burke, who talks in, I forget which book, about pieties, that you can kind of understand an audience about what it respects. What does it show piety to? Filial, family, or that literally means like the son. Filial piety, sacred piety, racial piety. Today on Twitter, some people were doing the hashtag all buildings matter, right? Showing that they didn't have the piety for the day that other people, in order to make a political point, that when you say all lives matter, that's an equivalent kind of statement of disrespect. So showing lack of piety in one area in order to show someone else's lack of piety in another. That kind of reciprocity. Those range of pieties, which constitute in effect the rhetorical stops through which his sensibilities are made responsive to artistic structurings of symbolic form. This is all Kenneth Burke. Stops here being like what Hamlet says, oh, you want to play me like a fiddle. Or, I'm sorry, you want to play me like a flute. Did you say flute, fiddle? What did you say? Pipe? Yeah, pipe, I think he says. You know all my stops, the little holes in me, so you can make me sound whatever tune you want, huh? But yeah, okay, people do have, you know how to push someone's buttons, you might say. But the rhetorical stops are those pieties, what people respect, that you kind of have to understand in order to know how someone might be responsive to your creative vision. That's kind of what he's talking about here. Connoisseur, critic, trickster, the little man is also a day coach, cabin class traveler. But the timing of his arrivals and departures is uncertain. Sometimes he's there, sometimes he's here. I spoke that wrong. Sometimes he's there, sometimes he's here. Being quintessentially American, he enjoys the joke, the confounding of hierarchical expectations fostered by his mask. We like to see the underdog win, That cultural incongruity through which he, like Brer Rabbit, is able to convert even the most decorous of audiences, the opera audience, into his own briar patch, and temper the chillest of classics, Virgil, the Aeneid perhaps, to his own vernacular taste. Hence, as a practitioner of art, a form of symbolic communication that depends upon a calculated refinement of statement and affect meaning emotion, feeling. The American artist must also know the special qualities of that second instrument, his native audience. Is an instrument of art. That's what he's saying. The audience as instrument, musical instrument, an audience upon which arousing, frustrating, and fulfilling its expectations to the conventionalized contours of symbolic action. Those genres of almost cliched things that we say, but those are shaped by the audience. He is called upon to play as a pianist upon a piano. Think about that. Think about how strange that is as an idea. The audience is your piano. I mean, that's what it means to know your audience, right? What are the possibilities here? It goes all the way back to that Aristotle idea of rhetoric as the ability to see, in any case, the available means of, well, for Aristotle, persuasion. But here it could be any kind of rhetorical effect. And the keys, those stops on the audience, you can play them in different combinations and get wildly different effects. So adapting to your audience doesn't mean flattering them. It doesn't mean, oh, what do you think about defunding the police? I'll tell you what you already believe. What do you think about Cante Hondo? I'll say that, right? It's not just being sycophantish and just responding to what people believe with affirmation. It's understanding all of that subtle layering of experience that comes from your native audience. Knowing that well enough that it's like your instrument. And of course, that means that there are other instruments, there are other cultures, other audiences that you might not be able to play as easily. This is one I'm struggling with a little. I'm thinking a lot about who I'm doing stuff for. Even though I'm putting stuff out, I want to be more for me. It's like an 80-20 thing. I agree with you, Alan. So another piece I like that's much shorter by this guy Wayne Booth. He talks about the rhetorical triangle. And he says, in any case, what you need to do is justice to three positions: yourself, your audience, and your subject matter, what you're talking about. And in every case, you need to do all of those. But you might think about it this way. You're like, I want to do it for me. I'm putting stuff out for myself. Would it be the same? It might be. Would it be the same? Would you be driven in the same way if you were just writing to put it in a drawer? Like, I'm doing this, for you and one other viewer right now, 2 people. And that completely changes how I feel about this. I couldn't even imagine what it would mean to do this. I wouldn't see it as equilateral. Well, that's a good point. I think it could kind of change and morph on the basis of the situation, right? What that triangle looks like depends on the kind of performance. There might be a really kind of narrow audience that you're thinking about when you're doing something really specialized or really interesting. Or maybe like you're really just trying to you're more concerned with a connection with an audience. And so you could be like, well, I am talking about a subject, but I could change it for anything. Right? So yeah, I like the idea of the triangle changing shape. That's very clever. I'm going to use that. And I'll cite you when I do. That's a cool change of the metaphor. But I still think that even in the idea of like being driven to do something artistic, any kind of writing, the imagination of an audience is part of the you that you are driven, that you're doing it for. You're kind of imagining your own audience. And so even if it's not that actual audience in front of you, you're like, I'm not worried about it doing numbers, as the kids say. Yeah, I think that's fine. I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think he's more talking about thinking about an artistic standard that's not based on some kind of arbitrary, static idea of what good art is. Good piece of writing follows these rules. Well, if it's not that standard, then how do we know what the standard is? And for Ellison, I think what Ellison's saying is the standard comes from our relationship to an ideal of audience rather than an ideal of art. I think that's one of the big ideas from this reading that I take. So the audience is you. You are your own audience in some sense. So when you say, my thinking is sometimes the audience is me. Yeah, exactly. Like if you if you ever say you're like, oh, that's not quite right, when you're doing that to yourself, when you're revising, when you're trying things out and being like, maybe I should go this way, that question about what is good or bad, that itself is kind of a test of some idea of audience that you're bringing to it. And it's that building up of expectations and experiences that you have, but you can represent as an other to yourself. That is audience, you might say. Words with friends from my mom. But here, a special, most American problem arises. Thanks to the presence of the little man, the second instrument can be a most unstable in its tuning. So again, he's like, it's changing, right? So if we go a little bit past where, that idea of the audience is the self, if it does become something that's more out in the world, and you do start getting feedback on what you're writing, you might start to be like, oh wow, the tuning is changing. And so even the things that I thought were good, it's not just that the audience is giving me feedback, but like my idea of the audience is changing too. And it's downright ornery in its responses. In approaching it, the artist may, if he will, play fast and loose with modes and traditions, techniques and styles. But only at his peril does he treat an American audience as though it were as easily manipulated as a jukebox. I love this metaphor. Audience is an instrument, not a jukebox. The music isn't already there. And that's the idea of like, well, it's just their opinions. I'm just going to kind of play back the hits. Take their opinion and give it back to them. No, you got to even if you want to play the hit, you got to perform the hit. You got to do a rendition of it. And if it sounds exactly like the recording, I'm going to say, boring. Heard it before. What have you done for me lately? Give me something new. Who are you? Why am I listening to you? I paid a cover for this. It's a 2-drink minimum. I want to hear something sexy, something that's lively. Or I want to hear, I just lost my love. You're playing this flashy crap. Give me something that I'm going to feel, right? The audience has all sorts of weird ideas about what you should be doing. I get freaked out of the idea of getting a bunch of followers and then trying to play to them instead of for myself. Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what is good about this idea of audience. It's not like the audience just becomes this monolith of opinion. And you have to say, oh, now we have to make a movie about, or now I have to write a script about like everyone's favorite comic book character. Because that's what the people want. That's really not what he's talking about here. He's talking about a certain ideal of audience that is both kind of unpredictable and is choosing from all of the tradition. He says it in an early part of the essay that for every artist, that little man behind the stove is at least complementary to you in taste, if not beyond you. So they know everything that you know and a little bit more. So it's kind of keeping you on your toes, rather than something where you're like, oh, I have to kind of like water this shit down because people aren't getting it. When you're doing that, if you're kind of watering it down, you're not really talking about the little man behind the stove. That's not the kind of audience you're performing to. You might be performing more to the empirically real audience that says, I want this. It's like when Arthur Conan Doyle, I love the Sherlock Holmes story. Guilty pleasure of mine. Arthur Conan Doyle like kills Shakespeare. Oh, that's a weird Freudian slip. Arthur Conan Doyle kills Sherlock Holmes. And then everyone writes in letters. It was like the first Twitter campaign to put a show back on the air. And they're like, bring him back. So then the story becomes really convoluted. He's like, aha, I wasn't dead after all. And it's bad, it's kind of bad. Because people wanted more Sherlock Holmes stories. But I think that's a different question than the little man. Yeah, I mean, either way, either watering it down for the audience that you have, or trying to do something that's just going to kind of bring in more people. Yeah, but again, I don't think that Ellison's talking about this at all. I mean, Ellison was doing like stuff that was quite niche, you might say. Ellison was kind of an avant-garde artist. He's gotten some fame now, but I don't think he's someone who is kind of like play to the masses. The little man behind the stove is distinctly not the massified version of taste. It's a sophisticated taste that And, you know, it might just be 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 people, but you're going to come upon it. And so that should be what you play to. That's what would be what you play to. Not elite taste, not mass taste, but the little man behind the stove. That's what's kind of cool about this. All right. In this country, the artist is free to choose, but cannot limit his audience. He may ignore the unknown or unplaced sector of the public. So there you go. But the mystifications of snobbery are of no avail against the little man's art hunger. Art hunger is a nice phrase, too. Having arrived at the interest in art through familiar but uncharted channels. The guy that learns opera from overhearing it from his upstairs neighbors and then starts going and borrowing some records. This kind of thing. He disdains its use either as a form of social climbing or of social exclusion. He's like, nah, that's not what opera is. You're like, well, certainly. Riakias. Or, you know, however you want to perform this kind of caricature of elite taste. That probably wouldn't be the one they would go for. Who would they go for? Anna Netrebko is certainly the greatest singer of our day. Again, probably not who they would go for. It's too popular. But the guy would just be like, why? He'd be like, why? Prove it to me. Give me your experience, not like not just like the opinion of the elite. That's not going to work here. Democratically innocent of hierarchical striving, he takes his classics as he takes his tall tales or jazz, without frills. I know somebody who's like, I like Cicero. He's a gossip. He's ratchet. Good friend of mine. I was like, that's one of the strangest opinions about Cicero I've ever heard. But like, it's that kind of thing of just like, yeah, I'm relating to Cicero in the way like I relate to other things. I'm not going to be like, Cicero in some other world. Cicero's in the same level as other things. You can name a name, but I've got no idea who it is. Yeah, it's exactly. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it could be opera. I'm using opera because he's going to talk about opera again at the end of the piece. But Placido Domingo, I don't know. They're one of the three tenors. You could use them. But while self-effacing, he's nevertheless given to a democratic touchiness. And is suspicious of all easy assumptions of superiority based upon appearances. Fancy people. They don't like I don't like fancy people. That kind of attitude. When fretted by an obtuse artistic hand, he can be quite irritable. What frets him utterly is any attitude what frets him utterly is a funny phrase. Is any attitude that offends his quite human piety by ignorance or disregard for his existence. Where am I in this cultural production? And of course, he's really focused on art here, but it could be anything. It could be anything, I think. Anything with an audience. And yet the little man feels no urge to impose censorship upon the artist, possessing an American vernacular receptivity to change. A healthy delight in creative attempts at formalizing irreverence. Formalizing irreverence. How do we do that today? Certain memes, right? Even that hashtag I was talking about before. Hashtag all buildings matter. Right? Formalizing irreverence. Kind of a gesture or habit of being like, I don't care about your hoity-toity in terms of that, or about your political piety, or your religious pieties, whatever. Thumbing my nose at certain things in a formal way that gets carried over and becomes part of the culture itself. And a Yankee trader's respect for the experimental. He is repelled by works of art that would strip human experience, especially American experience, of its wonder and stubborn complexity. Not that it demands that his own shadowy image be dragged into each and every artistic effort. Everything should be about me, I'm a Cubs fan. Right, it's not that. That would make a shambles of art's necessary illusion by violating the social reality in which he finds his being. It is enough that the artist, above all the novelist, dramatist, poet, that is, people working with words, dramatist works with more than that, of course, but forge images of American experience. Resonates symbolically with his own ubiquitous presence. Ubiquitous, everywhere. In The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway tells us, by way of outlining his background's influence upon his moral judgments, that his family fortune was started by an Irish uncle, who immigrated during the Civil War, paid a substitute to fight in his stead, and went on to become wealthy from war profiteering. Enough said. This used to be a thing you could do. You could say, you get drafted and you could say, well, I don't want to go, but I'll buy myself out since somebody else can go. This takes hardly a paragraph, but the themes of history, wealth, immigration are struck like so many notes on a chime. Assuming his Afro-American identity, costume, and mask, the little man behind the stove would make the subtle symbolic connections among Gatsby's ill-fated social climbing, the wealthy wastrels whose manners and morals are the focus of the action, because they're all these rich people having parties, right? That's the Great Gatsby. The tragic ironies echoing so faintly from the Civil War, that seedbed of so many northern fortunes, and his own social condition. Among the principles of the democracy that form the ground upon which the novel's drama of manners and social hierarchy is enacted, and the cost to Gatsby of confusing the promises of democracy with the terms governing their attainment. In so doing, the little underground outsider would incorporate the inside outsider, Gatsby's, experience into his own, and his own into Gatsby's, a transposition that Gatsby would probably have abhorred, but one that might have saved his life. So he's saying Gatsby's this kind of rich guy. So the little man version of reading this being like, oh yeah, well, if I was in that position, here's what I would do. Or I kind of see a little bit of myself in Gatsby myself. So this kind of reciprocity of taste and social experience that allows the little man behind the stove to have this kind of capacious imagination for things that maybe even are outside of their experience. Or again, the little man by imposing collaboratively his own vision of American experience upon that of the author, would extend the novel's truth to levels below the threshold of that frustrating and illusory social mobility which forms the core of Gatsby's anguish. Responding out of a knowledge of the manner in which the mystique of wealth is intertwined with the American mysteries of class and color, he would aid the author in achieving the more complex vision of American experience that was implicit in his material. As a citizen, the little man endures the social restrictions that limit his own social mobility with a certain grace. So he's like, oh yeah. You know what? It's not sour grapes, right? It's not I never wanted to be rich. It's kind of like, I like going to my local bar. Something like that. But as a reader, he demands that the relationship between his own condition and that of those more highly placed be recognized. So the little man might not be so attuned to a novel that's about high society, the kind of the dramas of a high society aristocratic family that don't account for the other kinds of people in the society. So they might not be as excited about like a Jane Austen novel. They might be. I don't know. And not out of a penchant for protest, nor out of petulant vanity. Petulant, like whiny. But because he sees his own condition as an inseparable part of a larger truth in which the high and the lowly, the known and the unrecognized, the comic and the tragic are woven into the American skein. Having been attuned at Chehaw Station to the clangor of diverse bell sounds, right? So he's back to this metaphor of the train station. Boop, boop. He asks not for whom the bell tolls, both a line from a John Donne poem and the title of a Hemingway novel, only that it be struck artfully, and with that fullness of resonance which warns all men of man's fate. That's a complex. So, John Donne in his poem, when he's talking about whom the bell tolls, he's sick in bed and he hears the funeral bells and he's like, for whom is the bell tolling? And he's like, well, it's tolling for me. I'm remembering my own death. It's this idea. And it's in the same set of poems where he says, no man is an island, right? We're all connected. A little bit of a reference to that. The little man has like a little bit of a different, his piety is a little different. He's like, he doesn't ask for whom the bell tolls. He's like, those funeral bells sound off. You need to ring those bells better. I'll show you how to ring a funeral bell. I actually have a friend that's really into ringing bells. He's been quite upset that during the pandemic he hasn't been able to do his normal bell ringing. Bells and bees. He's really into bees as well. Woody, your friend. How ironic. So at his best, he does not ask for scapegoats, but for the hero as a witness. How ironic it was that in the world of The Great Gatsby, the witness who could have identified the driver of the death car that led to Gatsby's murder was a black man, whose ability to communicate, and communication implies moral judgment, was of no more consequence to the action than that of an ox that might have observed Icarus's sad plunge into the sea. And there's no way that he's not imagining this painting. I'll see if I can pull it up for you. Landscape with the Fall of Icarus by Bruegel. The image. Yeah. Bigger. You can see. So this is a famous painting. Speaking of America, a lot of Americans like Bruegel, which is an interesting thing. But he's got, you know, before there was any such thing as the United States of America, Bruegel had a little bit of the American character in his art, you could say. This is called Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. See if you can find the Fall of Icarus in this painting at all. I might be blocking it, actually. Let me check my OBS. I'm probably blocking it, so... Yeah, oh, I definitely am. Let me go up. Let me move myself out of frame for a second. See if you can find the Fall of Icarus in this painting. It might take you a minute. I think, you know, most people initially you see, if you didn't know the title of this, you would see probably a guy plowing his fields, a shepherd, maybe the ships in the distance, but right around here, you see Icarus, who has fallen. So the story of Icarus, right? Daedalus, the guy who invented the labyrinth, the Minotaur, in order to get out of there, creates wings. He creates wings of wax. I'll bring myself back now for a second. Brings wings of wax. And then Icarus flies too close to the sun, didn't listen to his dad, and his wings melt. Yeah, I had to move out of the way. Exactly. Well, it's okay. I mean, it's not a Where's Waldo painting, you know. It's but you can see it now. You can see it now. Just the little legs. But it's kind of a funny comment on this, like, this great mythic event, you know, of Icarus falling from the sun, you know, this great story of hubris. It's just a little detail off to the side that you could miss. And then life goes on, you know. And it's this kind of attitude that's maybe the little man's attitude of just like, yeah, Icarus is in there too. The great mythic importance is in there too. But it's all in the mix of daily life, the comings and goings of the ships from other places. It's all kind of in the mix. I think that's the attitude. But anyway, I got a little too excited with the... I like this painting quite a bit. There's some good poems written about it. More than one. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's minimize. Back. Just double check that. Still a little. It's over a little bit. Just in case. All right. Ever see Titanic? There's a shot that's way pulled back with no sound. That's awesome. Similar thing, I think. I actually have not seen Titanic. I also admitted that I hadn't seen Jurassic Park. So, I guess there's a lot of the big blockbusters that I never got to. But I feel like I've seen Titanic and Jurassic Park, you know, because like what they mean culturally, I know that. But yeah. But yeah, it's similar idea probably of like, but there it's maybe more like melodramatic. It's more like you've spent this whole movie looking at this couple and like their romance, and now it gets set in this kind of big historical. Here it's kind of like almost comic, where Icarus is kind of off to the side, and it's supposed to be a painting of Icarus, right? And you just like see his legs kicking. It's kind of it's like almost darkly funny, but it's kind of funny, yeah. Bruegel's an interesting guy. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the name. Yeah, but alas, Bruegel. I don't know. Yeah. I don't think I'm going to finish this today. I'll probably do it in 2 parts. Well, I think I'm going to go for like another half hour or so. Because we, yeah, it's not, there's 27 pages in it. This one is a little bit longer than what I usually assign, but it's good. Okay. So a lot of this is about like literary references, and I assume that a lot of people have read maybe The Great Gatsby in high school, but it might be not like super present in your memory and things like that. So if you don't get all of the allusions, that's okay. But you can kind of work through the allusions by pausing the video or whatever and looking them up if you want to get more deeply into it. But sometimes when I'm reading something, I don't always look up every allusion. I kind of see first whether I think it's crucial for me to understand what's going on. And even sometimes when I think it is crucial, I'm like, well, I don't know how much I want to invest in understanding this one point. Is that important for what I'm trying to get out of this whole piece? And then I kind of make my judgment of how to spend my time. When I'm really, enjoying a piece, I often will try to get involved in the details. And sometimes I'm kind of like the little man. I'm like, I'm not sure I care too much about your details. So it's really up to how you feel about it. But sometimes it is important. So you have to make your own judgment about whether to look things up or not. And sometimes it might be difficult. It's not always clear how to do it. Sometimes the allusions are very oblique. They expect you to kind of just know something through a reference to a name. And you might miss references. All this is okay. It's to be expected. The more that you get used to kind of reading a little antagonistically and also a little bit more broadly, you'll start to get more references as you read more. So it's okay. It's a normal part. This is a big boy reading. Yeah, for sure. It is. I mean, Ralph Ellison is like, I would say, when we're talking about the great American novel, I would definitely put The Invisible Man as a candidate up there. So he's a very serious writer. But I think that he's also someone who imagined himself writing for an audience that was concerned both with literature and with kind of pressing questions of the time, and believed, maybe quixotically, it's another literary reference to Don Quixote, who fights with windmills. So if you do something quixotically, kind of doing it against the odds, or maybe almost naively or romantically, maybe quixotically believed that literature and politics had something to kind of say to each other. Yeah, it's a lot of pages. Yeah, 27 pages. Then when you get to grad school, when I got to grad school, and they were like, okay, read this book for next time. I had 3 classes. I was like, what? Read a book? So, but then it's just what you get used to. When you start running, you get to the end of the block and you're winded. You're like, holy shit, I'm never going to run again. But if you keep going out and you do it again, you're like, oh, I'm still winded, but like, I'm at least used to the experience. And then a little bit longer, you're like, oh, I'm actually it's not so bad. And then, if you keep doing it, then you can run a mile, then 2, and then 3, maybe you even start enjoying it. But that's kind of what reading's like, you gotta treat it as a practice. You gotta build up some muscles, right? And I think the one of the reasons that becomes difficult for people is you're presented with reading either already in a kind of like digest or collection. It's in a kind of textbook, rather than just I don't ever use textbook. So it's just kind of out in the wild, these like random things that are out of context. If it's already kind of pre-digested and you have, an introduction and all the words are highlighted, that it's maybe like, and it's always kind of right at your level, you never experience that challenge of reading. And maybe it's also kind of boring. You're reading stuff that's not super interesting. So what I try to find are readings that are both challenging and challenging in their content, in their language and in their content. You have to think new ways in order to understand them. But also that should interest you. They have some color, they have some character to them. So I don't always succeed. Not everybody likes everything. And I always ask my classes, on a 1 to 7 scale, where do you put this? If you really hate it, it's 1. If you really love it, it's 7. And usually, people fall along a various continuum of how they feel about a reading. And I think that's really okay. I think that sometimes, I know personally, some of the readings that have stuck the most with me, that I've thought the most intensely about through years, are ones that I began by hating. I hated it, and I needed to defeat it. And then I started to see, okay, I had some more wisdom than I thought, or it just kind of came from a different point of view. And then sometimes things that I remember loving, I kind of go back to them, and I'm like, I don't know, what did I love about this? That's sometimes a sad experience. So I think that those attitudes that we have towards specific readings change, but also, the how long can I go with reading is something you have to practice and build up to. Obviously, most people wouldn't be doing this of like commenting, being interrupted and commenting. So the stream's already at like 2 hours. You're like, wow, this would be a really slow pace to read at. But it might actually be like more of the accurate pace of which you would really read to digest and enjoy something. And if you are, if you're working, or if you are a student and you have all these other classes, this might seem impossible. Like, when am I going to get the time to do this? Well, come to my stream. We'll do it together. I don't know. All right. In this light, the little man is a cautionary figure who challenges the artist to reach out for new heights of expressiveness. If we ignore his possible presence, violence might well be done to that ideal of cultivated democratic sensibility, which was the goal of the likes of Emerson and Whitman. I sing the song of myself, that's Whitman, great poet. And for which the man at Chehaw Station is a metaphor. It's a metaphor. Obviously. Respect his presence, and even the most avant-garde art may become an agency for raising the general level of artistic taste. So there you go, Alan. Okay, yeah, take care. The work of art is, after all, an act of faith in our ability to communicate symbolically. Oh, hey, TJ. Oh, I didn't even see, because you were both green. I didn't realize that was TJ. That was you, TJ. Welcome. Yeah, it's a lot of pages. But yeah, you can do it. What's the longest that you? How long do you like read for in a sitting, TJ? Usually, because maybe you gotta pace it out a little bit differently. You gotta maybe be like, all right, I'm gonna read for half an hour, and I'll come back to this. And you just gotta plan ahead. Just do that a little bit. But this is the longest one for our class. Sure. But why would Hazel Harrison associate her humble metaphor for the diffusion of democratic sensibility with a mere whistle stop? So we're going back all the way to the beginning, where she says, you gotta like Chehaw Station. So that would be the Husky Card Services offices or whatever. Just a terrible place. Why associate democratic sensibility with a shitty train stop? Today I would guess that it was because Chehaw Station functioned as a point of arrival and departure for people representing a wide diversity of tastes and styles of living. Democracy is not a place where everyone kind of gather and listens attentively and closely to everything you're saying. It's a noisy train stop. People are coming in and out. People have all different interests and attention. And, if you want somebody's attention, you got to really get it, Philanthropists, businessmen, sharecroppers, students, artistic types pass through its doors. But the same, in a more exalted fashion, is true of Carnegie Hall and the Metropolitan Museum. Elite culture, right? All three structures are meeting places for motley mixtures of people. So again, this is not Motley Crue, but Motley Crue refers to that. A motley crew is like a crew of people who are all a little bit different, right? A little bit hodgepodge, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So while it might require a Melvillian imagination, Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, a Melvillian imagination to reduce American society to the dimensions of either a concert hall or a railroad station. He kind of imagines American society on board a ship in Moby Dick. Their common feature as gathering places, as juncture points for random assemblies of sensibilities, reminds us again that in this particular country, even the most homogeneous gatherings of people are mixed and pluralistic. Perhaps the mystery of American cultural identity, contained in such motley mixtures, arises out of our persistent attempts to reduce our cultural diversity to an easily recognizable unity. So we're always caught between this, unity, the unity of all of these things together, and the actual diversity. And let's be real, contest and controversy that arises between different types of people in American society. On the other hand, Americans tend to focus on the diverse parts of their culture, with which they can more easily identify, rather than on its complex and pluralistic wholeness. It's an interesting idea. So we identify with the diversity rather than the unity. But these are two sides of the same picture, right? It can only be diverse if there's two or more things that are together in some way. Yeah? That's a kind of unity. It's a dialectical idea. So rather than, what is dialectics? Okay, well now we're on a whole other big thing. But Hegel, oh boy. It's not the kind of exercises you do if you want to have a better sex life. That's Kegel's. Hegel, who is a philosopher, talked about dialectic as his method of thinking. And what he wanted to do is say, okay, Aristotle said that logic looks this way. There's the law of identity. A equals A. Something is itself. This is Aristotle. The law of non-contradiction. A is not A. It can't be not itself. And there's no excluded middle. It's either A or not A. There's nothing other to be. And Hegel's like, every single one of those is wrong. A is also not A. A is not A. And it is both A and not A, So there is an excluded middle. There's something that kind of comes out between. And that's the idea of like thinking about unity and diversity as two sides of the same idea. Something kind of comes out. You look at it from the point of view of differences, you see diversity. Look at it from the point of view of unity, you see unity. All right. That difference, that new and problematic quality, call it our Americanness, creates out of its incongruity an uneasiness within us, because it is a constant reminder that American democracy is not only a political collectivity of individuals, but culturally a collectivity of styles, tastes, and traditions. I don't know about your experience. My experience growing up was pretty clearly that. I grew up in a predominantly Vietnamese neighborhood, and sometimes you would see people doing things that you didn't understand. So we had like horse chestnut trees, or that's what I called them. I don't know if that's actually what they were. That's what we called them. And I would see like on Sundays, women would come up and they would gather the horse chestnuts. So I just started doing it too. I didn't know what it was for. They were going to make tea out of it, but I had no idea. But I was just like, well, these look pretty. I'll just I thought we were just collecting them, right? So sometimes you just start doing something because you're in the middle of people doing other things that you don't understand. And then you start a horse chestnut collection. In this lies the source of many of our problems, right? Racial conflict, racial inequality, gender inequality, obviously, source of many problems, economic inequality, especially those centering upon American identity. In relationship to the cultural whole we are, all of us, white or black, native born or immigrant, members of minority groups, beset by feelings of isolation because of the fluid, pluralistic turbulence of the democratic process, we cling desperately to our own familiar fragment of the democratic rock. So what's your fragment of the democratic rock? You might think about that. Oh, okay, I come from like New York State, kind of suburban area, Italian, American, or I come from the Bronx. Everyone I know is black or Dominican. You might try to cling to the thing that's most familiar to you, and those two experiences might seem radically opposed. Well, what does Ellison say? And from such fragments, we confront our own fellow Americans in that combat of civility, piety, and tradition, which is the drama of American social hierarchy. So he almost takes this third position of being like, oh yeah, Steve, it's going slow, but I'm enjoying it so much. We're on page 10, and I've been doing it for 2 hours because there's so much to talk about. But yeah, welcome to the stream. One of my students was saying that this is a big boy reading, which I like this phrase. So yeah. I don't think I've ever read it this carefully before. And so partly I'm doing this for myself, just to kind of like really attend closely to everything he said. Reading aloud forces you to do this. You have to really be careful about the meaning of your words when you're pronouncing them, pronouncing words, pronouncing phrases and sentences. Because if you read it without meaning in your voice, your audience isn't going to understand what you're talking about. So you got to be careful. You got to make choices. So yeah, what's your fragment of the democratic rock? You might think about that. I don't know. I think my fragment of the democratic rock is a little mix of like, I would say probably, a little more on the urban rather than the rural divide. Don't know a whole lot about rural life. I'd say I probably have to work a lot to come with a sensibility that would include that. I have to read, listen, understand, look at art from there to try to grasp that part of this weird pluralistic unity that he's talking about. Holding desperately to our familiar turf, we engage in that ceaseless contention, whose uneasily accepted but unrejectable purpose, easily accepted but unrejectable purpose, is the projection of an ever more encompassing and acceptable definition of our corporate identity as Americans. Now, by corporate identity, he doesn't mean like Wells Fargo. He means corporate in the sense of incorporated into one body. That's what corpus means in Latin. Corporis, body. We're all one body. Well, maybe we're sick. And this was the old, early modern idea of thinking about problems, political problems. The body politic is sick. How do we solve our problems as a body? You still are thinking about it collectively, even at that moment. Usually this contest, our improvised moral equivalent for armed warfare. Again, he's kind of working out of Burke, who we haven't read yet, but Burke talks a lot about how in the beginning of one of his books that I mentioned before, The Grammar of Motives, he says, kind of dedicates it to a purpose, ad bellum purificandum, for the purpose of purifying war. That's a weird thing to write a book for, that's especially one that's about like language and symbolism and all this kind of stuff. His idea is that war and the motivation that leads us to war and contest, we can't just rip it out of our experience of humans. What we can do is make it more symbolic. So, and as Ellison says, this proceeds as a war of words, a clash of styles, or as rites of symbolic sacrifice, in which Kabbalistic code words are used to designate victims consumed with an Aztec veracity, scapegoats. Now, it's 2020, and the Aztec veracity part, might not fly anymore, but obviously he's trying to talk about and again, Burke talks a lot about scapegoats, the replacement of a real victim, the kind of anger of a community that goes upon a real person or real group of people and gets replaced by something that's symbolic. And in the Muslim holiday, Eid, Big Eid, celebrates this moment where Abraham goes up the mountain and he's about to sacrifice his son, right? God tells him to sacrifice Isaac. He's like, holy crap. First of all, I had this son when I was like 80 or 90, and so was my wife, right? And she was like, that's impossible. And God appears and he's like, everything's possible with God. Like, God's kind of creepy. So, first of all, you gave us this son when we were really old, and now you're telling me I have to kill him? But I'm going to do it. The last moment, an angel comes, stops him. Jibril, I think, Islam, or Gabriel, stops his arm, says, don't do that. Sacrifice the ram instead. So it's the replacement of one human victim for an animal victim. We could take it a step further and say we replace when in Judaism the temple was destroyed by the Romans, the year 70. It's like, well, what are we now? We can no longer sacrifice. And then religion all becomes about the word, the Torah. So sacrifice becomes symbolic. And so it's that kind of movement of moving from violence to symbolism that he's talking about here. that's why when we're talking in class and people are like, there's too much argument. And I said, I might take the position that we just don't have enough argument. And we've had that kind of Dorito-style argument. I know not every section had this conversation, but this Dorito-style argument. What we want is to kind of make an argument that is as tasty as the dish that is that you would serve to guests. Okay. Indeed, so frequently does this conflict erupt into physical violence that one sometimes wonders if there is any other viable possibility for coexisting in so abstract, futuristic a nation as this. And that's the thing, something people are wondering right now, today, this very day. I've heard a lot of people say recently about their political opponents, especially on social media. Those people are living in a totally different reality. Living in a totally different reality. But if they were living in a totally different reality, there wouldn't be much of a problem. You wouldn't encounter them. The fact that we still encounter other people, that they become problems for us, that their points of view, their aggression, their institutions are still in our world means that they're not living in a different reality, but that their symbolic orientations might be completely opposed to our own. So how do we deal with that kind of conflict? It's a conflict around symbolism, about meaning, orientation. It's not just a question of what's true or false. I think that plays into it. Some judgments about it's a judgment of orientation. If we think about the judgment of what's true as an orientation, say, I think that's true, which means that we should follow through on that idea. This is the pragmatic idea, very American idea, as opposed to if it's false, we can kind of let that one go. Throw that fish back. But oftentimes things also aren't that clear. It's kind of true. It's half true. There's some truth in fiction, isn't there? I had you reading fiction for this week if you're in the class. So, the rock, the terrain upon which we struggle, is itself abstract. A terrain of ideas, although man-made, exert the compelling force of the ideal, of the sublime. What's the sublime mean? This is an old idea. It's also a rhetorical idea. It goes back to this guy. Well, it actually goes back even further than this. But probably the first writing that's about it, that's very a long, serious piece of writing, on the sublime by this guy, Longinus. Sounds like something you might contract. Be like, oh no, I've come down with some Longinus. Anyway, he was a writer, and he was talking about this sublime as these moments in speech in which your imagination kind of imagines something beyond its comprehension, and it creates this emotional effect of the sublime. And then people take up this theme later on, Kant, Edmund Burke. The idea of the sublime, something kind of magnificent or great, or the sublime of evil, something so horrifying it cannot be represented to us. Ideas that draw their power from the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Longinus 19. Yeah. Oh. It's hard not to make everything a food or disease metaphor. My students are already on to me for this, of always making everything about food and disease. Just my two main preoccupations. We stand as we say, united in the name of these sacred principles. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. Food metaphors just go viral all the time. Very funny, Steve. Viral metaphors are so fun to cook up. Very good. Yeah, cooking with viruses. You cook to kill viruses, right? I think so. I have to ask my girlfriend. She would know. I don't really know. I think heat does kill viruses, but I'm not sure. Very good. Yeah, okay. No, it's clever. It's very clever. Very clever. Like Data in Star Trek. But indeed, it is in the name of these principles that we ceaselessly contend, affirming our ideals, even as we do them violence. So you might think about it this way. People talk about one of these ideals, right, is liberty. Okay. And if we think about standing, literally, Colin Kaepernick's gesture of not standing or kneeling, genuflecting, you might even say, for the flag, became very controversial because some people were upset by saying, well, people fought for your freedom. Fought for your freedom. Live in this country, and you're not showing respect for that sacrifice. His gesture of kneeling was a protest of police brutality, specifically against Black Americans. He was saying, I'm not free. Your idea of freedom does not apply to me. And the way in which I am free is to do this, is to protest. So we contest on the ground of agreement. If someone said, well, I don't care about freedom, we wouldn't really be having the same kind of argument. We have to agree about freedom as a value, but how we shape it, how we define it, the examples that we give of it, what we make present to our audience, all of that's going to change based on the position that we take and who we are, our actual experiences. For while we are but human and thus given to the fears and temptations of the flesh, we are dedicated to principles that are abstract, ideal, spiritual. And this is true. This is not about being religious or something. Take any atheist off the street, and they're going to say, yeah, I believe in the truth. Truth is not abstract, not ideal. Well, it's not everything. You're saying some things aren't true. Or I believe in something in equality. That's an abstract ideal, isn't it? So these principles that were conceived linguistically and committed to paper during that contention over political ideals and economic interests, which was released and given focus during the period of our revolutionary break with traditional forms of society. And he's again imagining the American Revolution. Historical America. Principles that were enshrined, again linguistically, in the documents of state upon which this nation was founded, actuated by passionate feats of revolutionary will, actuated, brought to reality, made real, which released that dynamic power for moralizing both man and nature, instinct and society, which is a property of linguistic forms of symbolic action. Once again, Kenneth Burke shout out. Kenneth Burke talks about symbolic action as what we're doing when we are speaking, writing, using language, and all the other things that are symbolic action. These principles, democracy, equality, individual freedom, and universal justice, now move us as articles of faith. I stand for democracy. Well, today is September 11th. Democracy was one of the ideas, one of the justifications for the wars that followed from September 11th, 2001. We're going to bring democracy somewhere, right? At the same time that the person that was in office at the time, George W. Bush, came into office through a Supreme Court decision, Bush v. Gore, that some people felt violated the principles of democracy here in America. So again, that question of the contention of what is democracy, what does it mean, what are the examples, what are the images that come to mind when you imagine democracy? People who are in protests are often shouting, this is what democracy looks like, right? And have that little cadence. People shout it together. What does that mean? Why is that the chant of the protest? This is what democracy looks like. This as opposed to something else, maybe, that other people are imagining. And they want to assert, protesters want to assert that this form is more democratic. It's more aligned with the ideals that we share. Even those who are opposed to the protest share the ideal of democracy, right? Is it just an empty word? Perhaps, but it's also the site of contention that he's talking about. Holding them sacred, we act or fail to act in their names. And in the freewheeling fashion of words that are summoned up to name the ideal. I love this. So many good phrases in this essay. Steve knows what I'm talking about. The freewheeling fashion of words that are summoned up to name the ideal. They prod us ceaselessly toward the refinement and perfection of those formulations of policy and configurations of social forms, of which they are signs and symbols. So they move us to action, even though they are ideal, right? They become motives. As we strive to conduct social action in accordance with the ideals they evoke, they in turn insist upon being made flesh. And again, he's playing upon, we saw this in the Flusser essay, the same play upon the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word The Word was made flesh. The Word was God. And here he's kind of playing on the same idea of the Word becoming flesh. That when you have the motive of democracy, what you do in the name of democracy is making the Word flesh, right? Yeah, it is brilliant in many ways. I can't really do it justice, even though I'm spending quite a bit of time on it and just kind of commenting on it. But I like reading it so much that I think this is okay. I'm going to probably do it in a few parts, maybe 2 parts. Maybe it might take 3 parts to do this one. Inspiriting our minds and bodies, they dance around in our bones, spurring us to make them ever more manifest in the structures and processes of ourselves and of our society. As a nation, we exist in the communication of our principles. Listen to that. As a nation, we exist in the communication of our principles. The nation isn't the borders of the country, he's saying. It's in the acting upon and the sharing of the ideal. So it's all this symbolic stuff. That's where there is a nation. Thus, we argue over their application and interpretation as over the rights of property or the exercise and sharing of authority. The Word being made flesh makes me think about George Bush sending troops to Iraq in the name of democracy. Oh, 100%, right? That is one way of the Word becoming flesh. It's not all pretty. Yeah, it's not all pretty. This is not to endorse every action that's taken in the name of one of these ideals. You could think, because I study the early modern period, I'm often looking at all of these religious wars and religious conflicts in which everyone seems to be motivated by the highest possible spiritual principles that they often name when they then go and massacre each other. So yeah, it's how can we like refine those principles, as Ellison is kind of asking us? We should be prodded by the principle, by the development of the principle linguistically, in argument and in discourse and in art. So the kind of demand that we need to act now maybe sometimes is going to lead us to be one of those angels of death, where we become motivated by an ideal that we ourselves have poorly understood. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Somebody said that. I don't know who. Do you know? They interrogate us endlessly as to who and what we are. They demand that we keep the democratic faith. Words that evoke our principles are, according to Kenneth Burke, see, there he is. I told you he was going to come in here. Charismatic terms for transcendent order, for perfection. Being forms of symbolic action, they tend, through their nature as language, to sweep us in tow as they move. Tow, like as in the sense of, you're in a rip tide. You're in the tide of the water. You're being taken along with. So it's not kind of purely the individual acting. Forms of symbolic action, they tend, through their nature as language, to sweep us in tow as they move by a process of linguistic negation toward the ideal. Now that's a complicated sentence. We'll see how he unpacks it, and maybe we'll go back to it and try to work through it. That's a hard one to grasp. As a form of symbolic action, they operate by negating nature as a given and amoral condition, creating endless series of man-made or man-imagined positives. By so doing, they nudge us toward that state of human rectitude, for which ideally we strive. In this way, Burke contends, man uses language to moralize both nature and himself. Thus, in this nation, the word democracy possesses the aura, glow. In Flusser, we talk about the glow of words. The aura. This word is a word that has aura around. Of what Burke calls a God term. And all that we are and do exists in the magnitude of its intricate symbolism. So you could say a God term, like we've talked about with freedom or equality, are terms that are at once, they're not really in the world. We can use the metaphor of God here and do a little rhetorical theology to understand what maybe he means by this. That God's presence in the world, in many faiths, is kind of spiritual, ubiquitous, but not localized. It can kind of be anywhere. So in some sense, you could describe that as emptiness, but it doesn't mean it's not powerful. God is all-powerful. So God is everywhere. He's omnipresent, he's omniscient, he's omnipotent, but he's also kind of not clearly anything in particular. So you have to be careful when you're saying that's God. Someone will say, you're an idolater. You're saying that that's God? No, that's an idol of God. And we always have the iconoclast coming and breaking the symbol and say, no, God is greater than anything that you could imagine. He can't be depicted. In the same way, we could say, if we give an example of a God term, saying, well, this is what democracy sounds like. This is what democracy looks like. Someone else might come and say, your view of democracy is too limited. This whole nation is democracy, or my experience is democracy. My part of the democratic rock is democracy. So we have those debates under that term precisely because it is powerful and it is hard to locate. It is the rock upon which we toil and we thrive or wane in the communication of those symbols and processes set in motion in its name. In our national beginnings, all redolent with Edenic promises, Eden, like the Garden of Eden, paradise. Come here, the goal, they would literally put in newspapers to attract European immigrants about during some of the westward colonial expansion of the United States, saying things like, the roads are paved with gold. They would make these absurd descriptions that people didn't know. This is only reports they were getting. And so people would make this journey across the Atlantic and then come and be like, wow, there's a lot of trees. It's not all gold. So yeah. And also true, that's true at every period of American history where there are certain promises being made to various kinds of people. When the slaves were emancipated, they were promised 40 acres and a mule to get started. Well, that never came. People never got the 40 acres and a mule. And this is continues to be part of the national memory and national discourse when people discuss reparations. That's one of the legal justifications that reparations might be, well, what would be the equivalent, today's money, of 40 acres and a mule for all of the various descendants of slaves after emancipation? Or it could be of all of the unpaid labor of the slaves. That seems to be like an incalculable sum, in my opinion. But so yes, but since we are, he says, and since we vowed in a war right in the sense of like symbolic right, not like a mass, a Catholic mass, a rite of blood and sacrifice to keep its commandments, we act in the name of a word made sacred. And we're back at the sacred. It seems strange. Blucher is not a particularly religious guy, and he is also talking about the sacred in relationship to language. I don't know about Ellison's religious idea, but it's the sacred here is a feature of people when it's a feature of language. And people, when they think deeply about language, end up encountering the sacred again and again. Why do you think that is? I don't have an answer. What do you think? Why is the sacred related to language? How do we encounter it when we think deeply about how language motivates people? What's going on there? Yes, but since we are, as Burke holds, language-using, language-misusing animals, beings who are by nature vulnerable to both the negative and the positive promptings of language as symbolic action, we Americans are given to eating, regurgitating, and alas, re-eating, even Ellison's doing the food metaphors, even our most sacred words. It is as though they contain a substance that is crucial to our national existence, but that, except in minute and infrequently ingested doses, we find extremely indigestible. I'm not sure I like all this democracy when the democracy is blocking my commute to work. This is what democracy sounds like? Well, listen to the sound of my car horn. I want some smaller doses of democracy. Maybe he's thinking of attitudes like this. Some would call this national habit of word eating an exercise in the art of the impossible. Others attribute it to the limitations. Chef Ellison. I bet he could cook, He was man for all seasons, I think. He was kind of known in wherever he lived in New York for taking almost kind of like Baudelairean long walks around with his little pet dog or something. He was kind of like a dandy, I think. I don't know too much. You probably know more, Steve. There's that book, Shadow and Act. Oh man, all my books are all over the place. I have to find where they are. Cover them. That's hard to do right now. Yeah, I think I'm probably just gonna go like to the end of this paragraph. He was on my advisor's disc committee. Oh my gosh, I had forgotten about that. Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, that's cool. I bet there's all sorts of stories about. Yeah, what an interesting character. I hope the students like this reading and the other one. This is definitely like the most heavy reading, I think, in the class. It comes pretty early, but it seems like a good one to talk about audience and relating to things that are happening right now in our present moment. But also just, yeah, and also I'm still, I think that this is, we should have a conversation about the little man versus the universal audience at some point. Maybe we could do a podcast on that, because I feel like it's so, I feel like this is much better than the universal audience, but you know my feelings on that. Alas. So whatever the case may be, where was I? Habit of word eating. I can feel my throat getting a little tickly, so I'm probably going to end it pretty soon. I'll come back and do a part 2 tomorrow or something. Whatever the case may be, it would seem that for many, our cultural diversity is as indigestible as the concept of democracy in which it is grounded. We'll imagine America as Leave It to Beaver or something like that. They imagine they want that unity of democracy, but they don't like that plurality that's in the unity. Yeah, there are people like this. For one thing, principles in action are enactments. Principles in action are enactments of ideals, grounded in a vision of perfection that transcends the limitations of death and dying. Will you die for your country? That might be one of the questions about these kinds of principles. What are you willing to die for? By arousing in the believer a sense of the disrelation between the ideal and the actual, between the perfect word and the errant flesh. Errant meaning kind of doing wrong, literally erring, but it's an old-timey word. And there he's kind of invoking the biblical register to kind of give it this certain kind of grandeur. Perfect word, the errant flesh. They partake of mystery. Here, the most agonizing mystery sponsored by the democratic ideal is that of our unity in diversity, we were talking about before, as a kind of dialectical idea. Our oneness in manyness. Pragmatically, we cooperate and communicate across this mystery. But the problem of identity, problem of identity that it poses often goads us to symbolic acts of disaffiliation. Thus, we seek psychic security from within our inherited divisions of the corporate American culture. Again, corporate not like Walmart, corporate as in coming together as one body. While gazing out upon our fellows with a mixed attitude of fear, suspicion, and yearning. We repress an underlying anxiety, aroused by the awareness that we are representative not only of one, but of several overlapping and constantly shifting social categories. And we stress our affiliation with that segment, the corporate culture, which has emerged out of our parents' past, racial, cultural, religious, in which we assume on the basis of such magical talisman as our mother's milk or father's beard, that we know. What does this mean? I think here I might be reflecting on kind of like that ancestral loyalty that people have. Where some of the people that I know or where I come from really like to kind of, they're very attached to Irish American heritage. They like to think about where they came from. And this is part of what I grew up with. Everyone's always kind of reminding themselves of where we came from. And that is what gets emphasized. But that is so much more distant than, again, I grew up in like a Vietnamese neighborhood. Much closer to other cultures than that of the Irish. It's almost artificial kind of emphasis on this. And I think that comes from a kind of racial anxiety of white people, formerly immigrant people, who want to associate themselves with what the white part of their own culture. That might be part of what he's imagining here.
Grounding our sense of identity in such primary and affect-charged symbols, we seek to avoid the mysteries and pathologies of the democratic process. That process was designed to overcome the dominance of tradition by promoting an open society in which the individual could achieve his potential unhindered by his ties to the past. Yeah, and I think there was a lot of, especially in other places, I think a lot of people look at America from outside as a place that has very little tradition, where you're kind of freed from the weight of tradition in some cultures, where you're like, wow, it's like overwhelming. My kind of life is planned out for me. America, people just do whatever they want. There's this guy on Twitter who posts a lot of history videos about New York, and there's a very interesting one that he had recently about, I guess it was like maybe it was sometime maybe in the 80s, I think, of people buying fireworks on Canal Street. And there's police officers down there trying to like round them up, and there's different like mobs. There's like the Italian guy, there's the Chinese guy, and all the different guys selling different kinds of fireworks, and they're all competing with one another. And there's kids just lighting them off there, and there's all this kind of stuff. And there's one guy who they interview, because they're going around interviewing different people, and he's like, I believe he was Nigerian. I'm not sure where he's from, but he's like, in America, everybody does what they want. There's like firecrackers going off. It's crazy, you know. It's like Canal Street. It's old Canal Street. Things are crazy. It's like in America, people do what they want. I mind my own business. And it's this weird kind of moment of this disintegration that's also a kind of unity and pluralism. That we all kind of do our own business, mind our own business. And in that sense, you kind of create this weird culture of that in this moment was kind of this like chaotic movement. I mean, one guy gets injured because somebody lights off a firecracker and like his hands hurt. It's actually even dangerous. So there's that view of America as having like not a lot of tradition. I think if you asked Native Americans, for instance, they might disagree. And it's hard to say. Tradition, you might think etymologically about tradition as from the Latin to drag. Tradition is what's dragged from the past into the present. So it doesn't just arrive. Tradition doesn't just kind of refresh itself. It makes me think of that Sack Van Berkovich matches up with Ellison and the universal audience. You're going to have to remind me of the Sack Van Berkovich. Do I know that? I'm not sure I know that. Stuff on American descent being a unifying force in a weird way. I kind of feel like that's kind of where he's going with this one, too. And it's like the descent is the unity. And I think I missed that the first time I read this. I don't think I do. I probably should. Sack Van Berkovich. You have to send that to me. Check it out. I said I was going to end at this paragraph, and of course, this is like the longest paragraph in the thing. I'm like, oh, I missed it too. The story is what made me make the connection. Yeah, it's cool. The guys on Twitter, he's like kind of, you could say, an organic intellectual. I think he goes by his handle something like Drink Sola Pop or something. And his name is Solar Eclipse, and he posts awesome, like, fascinating videos of like documentaries that people took of like one of them that was really interesting recently of like the gay unit in Rikers Island, which I didn't know it existed, and it closed a few years ago. But they used to have like a unit designated for at that time there wasn't really a whole lot of language around like trans people, but you can kind of today we would probably say some people that were trans or were transitioning, and some gay people kind of in their own unit. And you see how they live in Rikers and what their lives are like. You know, all these kind of fascinating, mostly New York focused stuff. Really, really cool. You know, one of the reasons why I keep my Twitter account active. Yeah. Here, theoretically, social categories are open, and the individual is not only considered capable of transforming himself, but is encouraged to do so. However, in undertaking such transformations, he opts for that psychic uncertainty, which is a condition of his achieving his potential. Listen, students, listen to Ralph Ellison. That psychic uncertainty, that irritating doubt, which you feel, that is what you're trying to often avoid, maybe, sometimes. That's actually a condition of you achieving your potential. That's what he's... And he even says after this M dash, a state he yearns to avoid. Uncertainty, let's be real. Uncertainty is not a pleasant feeling, at least per se, not by itself all the time. Though there are things that we tend to enjoy, like uncertainty, like hope, you could say. That's really a condition of uncertainty. And so is fear. But hope and fear are really just kind of two sides of the same uncertainty. What's the image that you hold before yourself? Well, if it's the good outcome, you call that hope. If it's a bad outcome, it's fear, right? But becoming a little bit more comfortable in holding your position in uncertainty, of not running away from uncertainty at the very least, that's important for your education. That's always the case, but especially now. People keep writing emails in this uncertain time. Well, the uncertainty isn't going away. What would that even mean, right? If I'm going to start writing my emails in this certain time, in this time of great certainty, what time was that? That time has never existed. There's been no period of history where anyone wrote an email and said, "In this time of great certainty." It's not a time period. There's always uncertainty. It's baked in, baby. That's what it is. So, are you going to be educated for the time that doesn't exist? Are you really just going to try to hop on Elon Musk's rocket to Mars and follow the Tesla program for human potential in the future? I would say that's pretty uncertain too. But if your vision of the future is, I'm just going to follow the program, what program is that? There's none left, right? So you got to be flexible, got to be able to move. And so if you are more comfortable with that, if you can find it to be a creative resource, a way of expressing yourself, a way of something that's exciting about life, even at times when it can be scary, even at times when, I've had a lot of uncertainty recently personally that was very distressing. It's not always going to be creative and exciting. But even in those bad times, when it's the uncertainty, you're waiting for test results. Do I or does someone I love have cancer or not? Or the uncertainty of am I going to get this job? Is this check going to clear? This kind of stuff. Even in those really bad moments, you'll do better if you get more comfortable with the experience of uncertainty. Easier said than done, though, I know. But we're going to work on it. We're going to try to help each other get a little bit more used to one small aspect of that phenomenon. So despite any self-assurance he might achieve in dealing with his familiars, friends and family, he is nevertheless, and by the nature of his indefinite relationship to the fluid social hierarchy, a lonely individual who must find his own way within a crowd of other lonely individuals. There's a famous book by David Reisman called The Lonely Crowd, and this is a sociological view of America, that everyone's kind of, it's a little bit dated, but everyone's kind of lonely in the crowd. You ever been alone but around a lot of people? You're like, oh, being around a lot of people, damn, I would take that right now. I don't care if I'd be lonely. That just sounds nice. Maybe that's how you feel. Maybe you're like, finally, the world has come to see the light of my hikikomori lifestyle. I don't know where you're coming from, but yeah, of course you can be lonely in a crowd, because as I've said in class, what is here is not based on what is physically. What does that even mean? Where does physical presence end? How far out does that radius go? That's an absurd. You can see that doesn't make any sense if you think about it for a little bit. What is here? What is present to us? Is what's present to us in our concerns. And the people that are present to us are people that we can see have the potential to share with us concerns, laughter, joy, contest, anger, anything that's real in that human way. So a lonely individual who must find his own way within a crowd of other individuals. Here the security offered by his familiar symbols of identity is equivocal. Go this way, it could go that way. Say, well, maybe you came into college and you were like, well, I'm a varsity athlete. You're not playing sports right now. I know one of you in the class is saying, I played field hockey. Well, there's no sports right now. Now I'm getting a job. So that identity that maybe was very clear and was socially recognized. At this moment, it's kind of it's not so easily there. It's not so easily to see who you are when you're kind of looking at yourself from that other point of view. Well, what does it mean to be an athlete? Things like that. And an overdependence upon them as points of orientation. This way, athlete. This way, career. Who am I? Sister, mother. I know what I am. And this is how I orient myself. But if I depend too much on that, he's saying, it leads him to become bemused, which means confused, not amused. It means to be bemused is confused. Gazing backward at a swiftly receding, not quasi-mythical, past, while stumbling headlong into a pre-described but unknown future. That's a hell of a sentence. And I don't want to speak too poorly of my employer on this somewhat public stream. But I sometimes feel like maybe at Northeastern, and maybe at a lot of universities right now, we're kind of stumbling headlong into a pre-described but unknown future. And the idea that it has to be the way that it was described before. It has to be here in person on campus. It has to be a qualification for a career in some field. All these things. It's like, that's the description. That was the pre-description. We really don't know the future anyway. So are we going to be better oriented if we follow what was prescribed to us? Prescribed to us? Is that medicine good stuff? Or is that snake oil? It's not clear right now. And so maybe it's better to say, okay, well, even if that would work, I want to orient myself with the unknown, through the unknown, to the unknown. I'm going to become a surfer of uncertainty. And there's no better way to experience that than to get up, try to speak, try to say something that you care about, other people who you don't know, but who you have to know. And that brings us back all the way to where he talks about your audience is your instrument. You're going to play some combination. They might never heard it before, but it's based on them. And what you want to say. That's that relationship. Playing my music, but I need my instrument. Don't forget about your audience. I think I'm going to stop there for today. Thanks, Alan. Welcome back to the stream. You came back just in time for me to say goodbye. Because this is 2.5 hours. It's like I was playing Fall Guys or something. I'm starting to get actual stream lengths that I would if this was like a normal Twitch channel. But we'll come back tomorrow, and I don't know if we'll finish it or not, but we'll try it. Yeah. We can talk about I don't have to go right now. What do you want to say about the audience as an instrument? Talk about that. Do I have water in here? I don't. Very useful. Or maybe you're just kind of still pondering on it, and you're like, put a pin in that. We'll come back to it. That's cool too. So Alan's winding up. He is like a close. I listened to my first baseball doubleheader this weird season. Okay, that seems to have some intent from the purpose of the artist. Seems to have some intent, but like it's not fully in the control of the artist. But isn't that always true of artists? There's an amazing video. You could probably find it if I just tell you how to Google it. Of Matisse. He's the great painter Matisse. Painting, and there's a woman sitting for him. Take your time, type as you want. I'm just going to keep going on this example about Matisse. Maybe it's not what you meant, but it's okay. We'll find the cadence and rhythm of chat versus, because it's weird. Like Twitch is kind of two-way, but it's not really. It's not equal. Like I have a mic, you have a chat. If I play a sax and I'm in really good control of it, I can make it do what I want. Yeah, I kind of. But if to have really good control of the saxophone, you got to kind of like love the saxophone. You got to kind of do it you kind of have to like make your desires conform to the saxophone, right? Like if you want the saxophone to do, And I know that there's like a lot, people who like Pharoah Sanders or John Coltrane. Your various favorite sax players. Dan Getz. I don't know who you like, but the audience is its own thing. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine that bounces all over the place. I don't know. I kind of disagree with you. I think like my favorite jazz club ever is called the Fat Cat, and I spent quite a bit of time there. Quite a bit of time at the Fat Cat. It's in New York, and what's great about the Fat Cat is that every night they have. I don't know if this is still true. I hope it. I really hope it doesn't close, because that would really be sad for me. But every night they have 3 sets of jazz, and the cover to get in is $3, which is unheard of in New York. Like the Blue Note, the fancy jazz clubs, which is a funny, weird idea, like fancy jazz club. That is a thing. Tickets are like $40, plus you gotta get dinner. So it's like a cheap place to go in New York. It's like one of the cheapest places you can hear music. And it's got great music a lot of the time. But the audience, they also have like ping pong tables, and I played a lot of chess there. You can like get a chessboard. So there's like all these other games going on while you have like really good jazz musicians playing. Sometimes it's like samba. There's different things going on. And I think that would be like almost the quintessential example of what you're imagining. The Rube Goldberg. The audience is like not even. Is the audience even an audience? Are they even listening? Despite that being the case, I think that the way that people play in those kinds of spaces, a space where, and I know some musicians, and I've talked to them about this. I don't consider myself a musician, but I can play some instruments a little bit. When you're in a place where the audience is kind of inattentive, that actually changes your sense of what you can experiment with. Almost because the only person that's going to listen to you is the little man. That person, that obscure person. So you got to play to the little man when you have your audience that's kind of doing whatever the hell they want. So I don't know. I think that even in that case where the audience seems like they just don't give. Sometimes someone is like sleeping in class and kind of see that. I've had this experience sometimes where I can see a student visibly like nodding off, and I assume just because they're sleeping and not for other reasons. But then every once in a while, like the student that is like appears to be fully asleep will nevertheless, in the moment, like right towards the end of the class, they'll like pop up and then just say like a brilliant thing. It's happened to me multiple times. I don't know how to explain it. So I would say that the instrument, the audience, the player, all of these things are kind of like your habits are adapted to the instrument when you're in music. I'm not a master of the saxophone, right? I don't like command the saxophone to do what I want. The saxophone and I are collaborators. Or the piano and I are collaborators. And then I'm with my band and we all are collaborators. Yeah, but I wonder if there's not some times where like really great. So Alan's saying that like if I had control of my audience in the way if I have like mastery over my instrument, everyone would be paying attention. But I wonder if that's true, because like sometimes the best little moments, especially in jazz composition, are things where like the people who know how to kind of like let the instrument speak for itself. Where like Pharoah Sanders, for instance, let that kind of like blast of the saxophone, which is kind of him shouting, but also kind of his. Yeah, the little opening of the Little Man was. I think Alan was here at maybe not at the very beginning. Yeah, the jukebox metaphor, right? You don't want to just have the. Oh, you did miss the opening. You don't want to treat the audience like a jukebox, because that's like treating the audience and saying their opinions are already there. I'm just kind of selecting what's already there. When you might play the same song on the instrument, but like I want to hear your version. If it's the stale recorded version, then I'm gonna be like, why did I pay $3 even to hear what I could have heard at home? But yeah, it's an interesting question, Alan. I think maybe we do disagree a little bit, but I'll have to think a little bit more about that. Yeah, Aliens and Steve, you've met in the Discord because you're both in. Aliens is a Twitch rando by my designation. Yeah. Yeah, you can't control them. But again, I don't think you can control the instrument either. I don't think that masters of their instruments are really controllers of instruments. I think they've kind of learned how to coax the best from that. But that might be something, people might have different opinions about. I guess it's a metaphor in the end. Oh, so the last thing about Matisse, to make my point, and then I'll go home. I'm at home, but you know what I mean. Matisse is, they took a film of Matisse painting. So there's a woman sitting for him, and he's doing her portrait in his very distinctive style. And Matisse was shown this video of him painting, slowed down in slow motion. And before he would touch the canvas, you could see his hand kind of hover over it. It's as if it's making choices, like it doesn't paint the canvas until it finds its right way. Matisse was showed this, and he started to weep because of how beautiful it was. He wasn't consciously making all of those choices. His habit, maybe. But it was literally the camera captured a level of his own artistic production that was slow enough that it captured something that showed something he wasn't even aware of. So much that it moved him to tears. You can find this video. I think it's on Daily Motion somewhere. But yeah, it's a very interesting question about agency in art. But I'm very much unconvinced of the view of the artist as kind of the creator of all that is. One of my favorite books, and I've talked about it before with Steve, is Art and Agency. It's a difficult book. It's big boy reading, as TJ said. But one of the things he sets out early in the book is a kind of like 20, it's like a little chart of all the various relationships of agency and art that you could have. You might think of the artist as the agent, but you might also think of the artist as the patient. The artist is receiving something, maybe a commission from a patron. Another possible analogy to discuss next time, think about when you drop a bunch of balls down random spikes and they make a parabola. Like my intent would be to give the response that's in the center section. Oh, that's interesting. I like that metaphor, except I think the parabola kind of shows you a certain form of agency that comes from randomness. That like the natural distribution of the balls, natural distribution in the physical sense, will form that curve more or less every time, so long as you do it enough. So like, it would be a little bit quixotic, to use that term again, to try to be like, I'm gonna do this random ball drop as an artist, but I'm gonna get it in the center. It's like that, a little bit of noise or randomness might be like, I'm learning the art of how to produce something random. So I'm trying to produce a parabola. That might be the better attitude towards it. I don't know. That's a little of what I mean. When I play the horn, I can keep a really tight grouping. Oh, you play the horn. Maybe you could tell us more about that, because you probably have a lot more experience than I do on that. But well, for now, I'm gonna stop the stream. Sorry to cut it off. We have 4 viewers. One thing I've observed in every artist, this is Aliens, is that they almost always say they are simply the medium for the creativity that flows through them, but they never describe themselves as the source. Yeah, I think that's definitely, yeah. I mean, there's lots of variations on the ways that artists can be related to the agency and the art and all that. But I think I agree with you, Aliens. I tend to, at least the artists that I respect, I don't hear them often saying, like I think that it's both the feeling of like you have to practice, like you can't bullshit, and it's not just like, oh, express yourself. I think there are a lot of artists I know who kind of look down on that, of being like, you got to respect something. You got to respect a tradition or an art or your audience. But in the moment of creation, it's not calculative agency or rationality goes into art. So it's kind of like being in the zone athletically. I can post a cool thing from a Zen master about this idea in the Discord. Brad Warner, he's in a punk band and talks about this. Yeah, this is an endless topic, the topic of agency in art, as well as responsibility in action, generally speaking. But I do have to actually go because I have to pick someone up from work. So we have come to the artificial ending of this great conversation. But if you want to come back, I'll probably just do this tomorrow because, I'll do it tomorrow. I'm not sure what time, but you can let me know in the Discord. I think all of you are in the So you can let me know in the Discord what's a good time for you. All right. See you, folks. This is fun. This is fun. I'm not writing as much as I should be, but at least I'm doing something with other people. Glad that you're here with me today. Take care.